He was the loneliest billionaire in the world. She was the invisible woman nobody truly saw. And it all started with a tiny red heart drawn in ballpoint pen on a crumpled receipt. But before this love story could begin, it almost ended in the worst way possible. Stay with this story until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment with the name of your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The cafe smelled like burned espresso and someone else's morning. That was the first thing Nathan Sterling noticed every time he pushed open the glass door of Hollow Creek Coffee. Not the warm lighting, not the acoustic guitar bleeding softly from the speakers, not the smell of cinnamon that the owner, a stout Greek man named Petros, claimed was his secret weapon. Just the burned espresso. Always the burned espresso. And somehow, after 11 months of Tuesdays, it had become the most comforting smell in Nathan's life. That probably said something about his life that he didn't want to examine too closely. He was 32 years old and, according to Forbes, the 47th wealthiest person in North America. His company, Sterling Meridian, had offices in 9 countries. He owned a penthouse in Manhattan, a house in the Hamptons he'd visited exactly once, and a private jet he used mostly to send his executive team places while he stayed behind with his daughter. He wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars, though the face had a small scratch on it from when Lily, his 5-year-old, had thrown a toy across the kitchen 14 months ago. He hadn't fixed it. He didn't want to. He looked like a man who had everything. He felt like a man standing in an empty parking lot at midnight, waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. The Tuesday ritual had started by accident. Almost a year ago, he'd been driving home from a board meeting that had lasted 3 hours longer than it should have, running on 4 hours of sleep and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from caring about the wrong things for too long. His usual route home was blocked by a water main break, and his GPS had rerouted him down a street he didn't recognize. A quiet, slightly worn neighborhood in the western part of the city where the buildings were 2 stories tall and the parking was free and the restaurants had handwritten menus taped to their windows. He'd pulled over because Lily had been fussing in the back seat, and he'd needed a minute. Just a minute. He'd seen the cafe and thought, fine. Coffee, then home. He'd walked in, ordered a black coffee at the counter, and sat in the corner booth by the window. The coffee had been slightly too bitter. The booth had a crack in the vinyl that his jacket kept catching on. The playlist had been inexplicably heavy on early 2000s country music, which he had never liked in his life. He'd stayed for an hour and 40 minutes. When he finally got back in the car, Lily had fallen asleep. He'd sat in the parking lot a little longer than necessary before starting the engine. Something about that hour, the creaky booth, the terrible playlist, the coffee that nobody would ever describe as good, had done something to the weight he carried in his chest. Not removed it, just shifted it slightly. Enough to breathe. He'd come back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. By the 4th Tuesday, the woman at the counter knew his order without him saying it. Black coffee, 1 sugar, and if they had the almond croissants in, one of those too. She always had it ready by the time he made it from the door to the register, which shouldn't have been possible given how quickly he walked, and he'd never figured out how she managed it. Her name was Emma. He knew that from her name tag, which was slightly crooked and had a small dent in the E, as if someone had stepped on it at some point. He'd learned almost nothing else about her in the months that followed, which was unusual for him. Nathan had built his career on reading people quickly, on asking the right questions, on knowing within 10 minutes of a conversation who someone was and what they wanted. But Emma was different. Not evasive exactly, just economical. She answered what was asked and volunteered almost nothing. She smiled when something was funny and didn't when it wasn't. She never asked him anything personal. She treated him like a regular person, which at this point in his life was so rare it felt almost exotic. She also, he had noticed, drew small red hearts on his receipts. The first time, he'd assumed it was a mistake, some marking she'd made while doing something else, her pen slipping on the paper. He'd crumpled it up without thinking much about it and left it on the table. But the following Tuesday, there it was again. A small, slightly uneven red heart in the bottom right corner of his receipt, just below the total. Neat enough that it was deliberate, imperfect enough that it wasn't printed, drawn by hand. He'd looked up from the paper. Emma had been wiping down the counter at the far end, her back to him. The Tuesday after that, he'd watched more carefully. He'd seen her pull his receipt from the printer, turn slightly away as she tucked it under the edge of his cup, And if you weren't paying close attention, you would have missed the quick movement of her hand. The small red pen she kept in her apron pocket, the 2-second pause, the way she set the cup down just a little more gently than necessary. He'd unfolded the receipt later, in the car. Another heart. He told himself it was nothing, a habit she had with customers, some kind of café quirk, maybe something Petros encouraged for the regulars. He told himself that every week for the next 3 months, and every week he'd unfolded the receipt with his heart doing something slightly embarrassing, and every week there was the small red heart waiting for him. He'd started keeping them, not intentionally at first. The first few had just ended up in his jacket pocket instead of the trash. And then he'd found them while emptying his pockets one night after Lily was asleep. 3 small folded receipts with 3 small red hearts, and he'd put them in the top drawer of his nightstand instead of throwing them away. He couldn't have explained why if someone had asked. He simply hadn't wanted to throw them away. The drawer had gotten heavier over the months. He never mentioned it to Emma. She never mentioned it to him. It sat between them every Tuesday like a secret that neither of them was ready to talk about yet. And somehow that was okay. Somehow the not talking about it was its own kind of conversation. Okay. The Tuesday in early November started like every other one. Nathan arrived at 5:47 p.m., which was 7 minutes later than usual because there'd been a problem with a supplier in Singapore and his COO had called 3 times during the drive. He'd let the third call go to voicemail. He'd deal with it tomorrow. Tonight was Tuesday. The cafe was quiet. Petros was in the back doing something that involved a great deal of clattering. 2 college students sat near the door with laptops and headphones and the slightly haunted look of people who had been studying for too long. An older man Nathan vaguely recognized from previous Tuesdays was folded over a paperback in the corner, a cup of tea long gone cold beside him. Emma was behind the counter. She was in the middle of explaining something to a teenage boy who looked like he'd just started working there, maybe 16, maybe 17, with the particular expression of someone who has been told the same thing twice and still isn't sure he's gotten it. Emma was patient. She was pointing at the espresso machine with one hand and using the other to demonstrate something, and her voice was low enough that Nathan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was the same one he'd heard her use with difficult customers. Steady, calm, no irritation in it, even when irritation would have been reasonable. She glanced up when the bell above the door rang. "Hey," she said. Not "welcome in," not "good evening," just "hey," the way you say it to someone you actually know. "Rough day?" "How can you tell?" "You're 7 minutes late and you're still wearing your earpiece." Nathan reached up. The small wireless earphone was still in his left ear, which meant he'd been half listening to business calls this whole drive without registering it. He pulled it out and dropped it in his jacket pocket. "Better?" he said. "Little bit." She was already pulling his cup. "Almond croissants are gone. I'm sorry. Tommy," she gestured at the teenager, "dropped the last one on the floor about 20 minutes ago." Tommy went slightly pink. "I said I was sorry." "You did," Emma agreed without looking up from the coffee. 3 times. "It's fine, Tommy." She glanced at Nathan. "We have a new thing. Brown butter and pear. Petros is very proud of it." "Is it good?" "Honestly, I don't know yet. I've been too busy to try one." She set his coffee on the counter. "You could tell me." First test customer? First willing one. Tommy ate one, but he'd already dropped the almond croissant, so his judgment's compromised. Nathan almost smiled. Tommy looked deeply offended, but said nothing. Nathan took the coffee and one of the brown butter pastries to his usual booth, settled into the cracked vinyl seat that he'd privately become fond of, and spent the first 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing except looking out the window at the street. That was the other thing about Tuesdays that he couldn't explain to anyone. At his office, at his apartment, even at the home of his parents when he visited on holidays, he was never allowed to just sit. There was always someone who needed something, always a problem that had been waiting until he was physically present to announce itself. Always Lily tugging at his sleeve, or his phone vibrating in his pocket, or his own brain churning through tomorrow's agenda. He hadn't realized, until those first few Tuesdays at Hollow Creek, how long it had been since he'd simply sat somewhere and existed without an agenda. The pastry was very good. He'd tell Emma that. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from his mother, asking if he was bringing Lily to Thanksgiving this year. He typed back yes and put the phone face down on the table. The older man with the paperback stood up to leave, tucking the book under his arm. He nodded at Emma on his way out. She nodded back, and there was something in the exchange, some small weight of familiarity, like two people who have seen each other through enough seasons that words aren't always necessary, that made Nathan aware, not for the first time, of how much he didn't know about Emma's world beyond this counter. He knew almost nothing about her, actually. He knew she worked Tuesdays, and at least some other days, because occasionally he'd drive past on a Thursday and see the cafe lights on and imagine she was in there. He knew she was approximately his age, maybe slightly younger. He knew she was good at her job with a thoroughness that went past professionalism. She remembered people's orders, noticed when someone was upset, had a way of making a $4 cup of coffee feel like something someone had made specifically for you. He knew she was from somewhere other than the city because occasionally a word would come out with a different inflection, though he'd never figured out where. He knew that on 2 separate Tuesdays it had been raining when he arrived, and both times her shoes had been wet, which suggested she walked or took transit rather than driving. He knew she drew red hearts on his receipts. He knew that those hearts had become the best part of his week, in a way that made very little sense for a man with his resources, and that the fact that he had never said so out loud was becoming increasingly dishonest. He was thinking about this, about honesty, about small red hearts, about the particular cowardice of a man who could negotiate 8-figure deals and still couldn't bring himself to say a simple thing. When the door opened and the temperature in the room changed, not literally. The November air came in, yes, and the candle on the counter nearest the door flickered. But what Nathan registered was something else, something in Emma's face, which he could see from his booth in the mirror behind the counter. The particular quality of stillness that settles over a person when they see something that stops them cold. She was holding a coffee cup. She didn't put it down. She didn't move. Nathan turned. The man who'd walked in was around 30, maybe 35. He was tall, with the kind of build that suggested he'd played sports in college and hadn't entirely let that go. He was well-dressed, not wealthy exactly, but someone who put thought into how he looked. He had dark hair, eyes set a little too close together, a jaw that was probably charming in certain lights. He was looking at Emma the way Nathan didn't like. Not threatening, nothing you could point to, just the way a person looks at something they still think belongs to them. "Hey, Em," the man said. Emma set the coffee cup down very carefully. "Ryan." One word. Nathan had met enough people in negotiations to know that a single word could carry a full paragraph of information if you knew how to listen. That one word, the complete absence of warmth in it, the careful steadiness of it, the way it landed in the room like a door closing, told him several things at once. She knew this man well. She hadn't wanted to see him, and whatever was between them had not ended cleanly. Tommy, the teenager, had materialized somewhere near the back and was doing a poor job of pretending not to watch. Petros was still clattering in the kitchen, oblivious. "You look good," Ryan said. He was leaning against the counter slightly, the easy posture of someone trying to seem casual while being very deliberately present. "It's been what, 8 months?" 10, Emma said. Her voice was the same careful, steady tone she used with difficult customers, except there was something underneath it now, a tightness around the edges that Nathan suspected most people wouldn't catch. "I've called a few times." "I know." "You didn't—" "I know, Ryan." A silence settled. Ryan glanced around the cafe, taking it in. The worn furniture, the hand-chalked menu board, the holiday lights Petros had put up 2 weeks early. His expression didn't change, but something in the slight movement of his eyes suggested he'd assessed the place and found it small. "I just wanted to talk," he said. 5 minutes, that's all. This isn't a good time." "When is?" "I don't know." Emma picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter, a gesture so automatic it was clearly displacement, her hands needing something to do while her face remained composed. "I don't think there is one, honestly." Ryan exhaled slowly through his nose. "Em, I've been trying to. I know what you've been trying to do. Her voice was still quiet, still even. I'm working right now. Nathan had not moved. He was very still in his booth, his coffee growing cold in front of him, watching Emma's reflection in the mirror. He had not yet decided whether to do anything or what doing anything would even look like. He was acutely aware that this was not his business. He was a customer. He came here on Tuesdays. He didn't know her middle name. He also knew, with the particular certainty that sometimes appears before logic can catch up to it, that if this man said one more thing that made Emma's hands tighten on that cloth, Nathan was going to get up. 5 minutes, Ryan said again. After your shift. That's all. Emma looked at him directly for the first time. No, she said. Ryan's jaw moved slightly. You can't just keep... Ryan. Her voice dropped. Not softer, smaller, which was different, like she was pulling something back that she'd allowed too close to the surface. Please, not here. A long beat. Ryan looked around the cafe again, and this time his eyes landed on Nathan, and Nathan met them without expression. Something shifted in Ryan's face, a recalibration. He looked back at Emma. I'm not giving up, he said. It wasn't a threat. That was almost worse. It sounded like something he'd rehearsed, something he genuinely believed was romantic. I know you're not, Emma said quietly, but I'm not changing my mind either. So, she turned back to the coffee machine. The conversation was over. Ryan stayed for another 3 seconds, which is a very long 3 seconds when a room is quiet. Then he pushed off the counter and walked back out. The door swung shut. The candle stopped flickering. Emma stood with her back to the room for a moment. Her shoulders rose and fell once. Tommy appeared from wherever he'd been hovering. You okay? Yep. She turned around. Her face was composed. The same face Nathan saw every Tuesday, except that her eyes were doing something she was working hard to control. Go check on the brown sugar syrup. It was running low. Tommy went. Emma looked at Nathan's booth. He was looking at her, and he didn't look away when their eyes met, which was unusual. Most people would have found something else to look at, pretending they hadn't witnessed what they'd just witnessed. Sorry about that, she said. You don't need to apologize. Force of habit. She picked up the coffee cloth again, then put it down when she realized she'd already cleaned that section of counter. Is the pastry okay? Nathan looked down at his plate. He'd eaten most of it. It's excellent, he said. Tell Petros I said so. He'll be insufferable about it. He's earned it. A small, real, slightly tired smile crossed Emma's face. Nathan watched it happen and felt something loosen in his chest. A knot he hadn't been aware he was holding for the last 10 minutes. She moved to the far end of the counter to help a woman who'd just walked in. Nathan sat with his cooling coffee and looked out the window at the street. He thought about the way Emma had said Ryan's name, the way she'd said no, the steadiness of it, and the cost of that steadiness. Because he knew, with the particular knowledge of someone who had spent years maintaining composure while something inside was quietly in pieces, that keeping a voice that calm doesn't come for free. He thought about the hearts in his nightstand drawer. He thought about the fact that in 11 months of Tuesdays, she had drawn a heart on his receipt every single week, and he had kept every single one, and neither of them had said a word about any of it. He thought about honesty, about small cowardices, about the way some things you postpone because you're not ready, and other things you postpone because you're afraid. And the difference between those two categories is bigger than most people admit. He picked up his coffee. He finished it. When Emma brought his receipt 20 minutes later, she set it on the table without meeting his eyes, the way she always did. He waited until she'd turned away, then unfolded it. The heart was there. Slightly smaller than usual, maybe. Or maybe he was imagining that. He folded the receipt carefully and put it in his jacket pocket with the others. He'd been told once by his grief counselor, a quiet woman named Dr. Sato, who he'd seen for 8 months after Claire died, that the hardest part of loss isn't the obvious grief. It's the way it trains you to think of yourself as someone who has already used up their share, that the love and the belonging and the ease of just being with someone, those are things you had, and they were taken, and asking for them again feels greedy, presumptuous, like you're trying to get back something you don't deserve a second time. He hadn't argued with her. He'd listened and nodded and gone home to his daughter and his penthouse and his 11 time zones of business obligations, and he'd kept moving because that was what you did. Claire had been 28 when she died. A rainy April night, a truck driver who'd fallen asleep, an intersection that Nathan still couldn't drive through even 3 years later. She'd been on her way home from her sister's birthday dinner. She'd sent him a text from the car, not while driving because she was careful, always careful, asking if Lily had gone down okay. He'd replied yes and a heart emoji. That was the last thing he'd ever said to her. He didn't tell people that part. He didn't tell people much, actually. That was part of the problem. He had an excellent COO and a good therapist and parents who called on Sundays and a daughter who still reached for his hand in the night when she had bad dreams, and not one of them knew how loud the apartment got at 2 in the morning when it was just him. How he'd started sleeping with the television on low, not because he wanted to watch it, but because silence had become the thing he was most afraid of. He drove home through the November streets with Emma's receipt in his pocket and the quiet hum of the city around him, and he thought about the way she'd looked when Ryan walked in, that fraction of a second before her face went still, when something raw and old and unfinished had moved across it. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror more times than he could count. Lily was awake when he got home, which she wasn't supposed to be. She was in the hallway in her pajamas, purple, with small white rabbits on them, because she'd gone through a phase with rabbits, holding her stuffed elephant named Kevin in one arm and looking up at him with the particular expression of a 5-year-old who knows very well she should be in bed and has decided this is not her problem. "You're up," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "It's past 8:30. "I know." She patted toward him across the hardwood floor and held up her arms in the universal small child gesture that means carry me. And he picked her up without thinking about it, the way he'd been doing since she was 7 months old, and probably would do until she was old enough to be embarrassed by it. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo she'd decided was her favorite 3 months ago and showed no signs of changing her mind about. He held on to her a little longer than he usually did. "You went to the coffee place," she said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know?" "You smell like it." She pulled back to look at him with very serious brown eyes that he recognized as entirely her mother's. "Also, you're less crunchy." "Less crunchy?" "You know." She made a vague gesture that apparently communicated something she considered obvious. "You come home from work all crunchy, like your face, and then on Tuesdays you're less crunchy." Nathan looked at his daughter. She was 5 years old and had apparently been conducting some kind of ongoing behavioral assessment of him. He said. "Was the coffee lady there?" He carried her down the hall toward her room. "She's always there on Tuesdays." "Does she still draw the hearts?" He paused in the doorway of her room. He'd told Lily about the hearts, or rather, Lily had found one of the receipts when she was going through his jacket pockets looking for the gummy bear he'd promised her and hadn't delivered, and had demanded a full explanation, and he'd given her the best one he had, which was not very good. "She does," he said. Lily considered this with the grave seriousness she applied to most things. "Did you ask her why?" "Not yet." "Dad." Her tone was deeply, personally disappointed in him. "I know, Lil. She draws them every week." "I know." "That means something." "I know." She looked at him with the specific exasperation of a child who has realized she is smarter than the adult she is talking to and finds this both satisfying and deeply inconvenient. "You should ask her," she said. "I will." "You said that last week." "I'm going to." She settled back against his shoulder with the sigh of someone who has given all the advice she can and must now leave the rest to forces beyond her control. He put her in bed, tucked Kevin the elephant in beside her, and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark for a moment. "Dad?" Lily said, in the small voice she only used at night, when the dark made certain things easier to say. "Yeah." "Do you like her?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city made its ambient nighttime sounds. A distant siren, a car horn, wind against the windows. "I don't know her well enough to know," he said. which was both true and not entirely true in the way that a lot of honest adjacent things are. Lily was quiet. Then, "I think you do." He kissed her forehead. "Go to sleep." "Okay." She closed her eyes, then one eye half open. "She sounds nice." "She is. Nice is good." "It is." The eye closed again. Within 4 minutes, she was asleep, the way children can be. Completely, immediately, without apparent effort. Nathan sat in the dark of her room for a while after that, listening to her breathe, watching the streetlight pattern move across the ceiling. He thought about what it would mean to stop being afraid. He thought about small red hearts on crumpled receipts. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded paper. He didn't open it, just held it. After a while, he put it in the drawer with the others. The following Tuesday came the way all Tuesdays did. Too fast and not fast enough. Nathan had thought more than once during the week about what Lily had said. You should ask her, as if it were simple. As if Nathan Sterling, who had once sat across a table from 2 hostile boards of directors and negotiated a merger that everyone said was impossible, could not figure out how to ask a woman why she drew hearts on paper. He'd also thought, more than once, about Ryan, about the way that name had landed in Emma's face, about what kind of history produced that kind of stillness. He arrived at 5:40 p.m., 7 minutes early, which was itself a kind of answer to a question he hadn't quite asked himself. The café was in the middle of what passed for its dinner rush, which meant there were 6 people in it instead of 3. Emma was moving between the counter and the pastry case, and Tommy was at the register with the focused expression of someone trying very hard not to make a mistake. She saw Nathan come in, and something in her face shifted. Not the cafe employee smile she gave the other customers, something quieter and more specific than that. She held up one finger, 1 second. He sat in his booth. She brought his coffee herself, 3 minutes later, setting it on the table and sliding into the booth across from him with the unselfconscious ease of someone who has made a decision, which was new. She had never sat down at his table before. "Slow day," she said, which was not even slightly true given that Tommy was currently scrambling to take 3 orders at once. "Clearly," Nathan said. She folded her hands on the table. She had small hands, he noticed, with ink on the outside of her right index finger. Not the red pen, something else, a darker blue, like she'd been writing something before her shift. "I wanted to apologize," she said, "about last week. What happened? Ryan showing up here? You shouldn't have had to sit through that." "You don't have to keep apologizing for that." "I know, She exhaled. "He showed up here. At my work. That's a thing that doesn't feel okay to me, and I've been thinking about it all week, and I wanted to say something." "Is he going to be a problem?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think so. He's not dangerous, just..." She looked down at her hands. "Persistent. He thinks persistence means something, like if he just keeps showing up, eventually I'll change my mind." "Will you?" She looked up. "No." "Okay," Nathan said. Something in his voice must have been different from what she expected, because she looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. "Okay," she repeated slightly quizzically. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "You don't have to tell me what it's about," he said, "but if he comes back and you want me to..." He wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. Be here sounded presumptuous. Do something sounded wrong. "I'll be here on Tuesdays," he said. "That's all." Emma looked at him steadily. Something in the quality of her attention changed. She was really looking at him, and he held it, and neither of them did the polite thing of finding something else to look at. "Okay," she said again. Quieter this time. She slid out of the booth and went back to the counter without another word. Nathan sat with his coffee. He could hear Tommy messing something up with the milk frother. He could hear Petros beginning to lecture Tommy about it in what was probably meant to be a quiet voice. He drank his coffee slowly. When she brought his receipt at the end of the evening, she didn't linger, but as she turned to walk away, he said, without planning to, "Emma." She turned. He wasn't sure what he'd meant to say. Several things moved through his head. He settled on, "The brown butter pastry was better than last week, if that's possible." She almost smiled. I'll tell Petros that. He'll be insufferable. He'll be the happiest man alive. She tucked the small red pen back into her apron pocket. He could see it now, knowing what to look for. Good night, Nathan. Good night. He waited until she'd gone back behind the counter before he unfolded the receipt. The heart this week was the same size as always, but beneath it, very small, in the same red ink, were two words he'd never seen there before. Thank you. He read them twice. He folded the receipt very carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He sat in the booth for a long time after that, listening to Tommy and Petros and the acoustic guitar and the low, steady sound of the city outside. And he thought about what it means to be seen by someone. Truly seen, without agenda, without the particular performance that wealth and grief require of you, and how rare that is, and how you recognize it when it finally happens, the same way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years, not with your mind, but with your whole chest, before you even know the words. He drove home. He put the receipt in the drawer. He did not sleep for a long time. The drawer in Nathan's nightstand had started to feel heavy. Not literally. The receipts were paper, thin as breath, and the whole stack of them weighed almost nothing if you put them on a scale. But Nathan had started to notice the drawer the way you notice something you're trying not to think about. He'd reach for his phone in the morning and his hand would pass near it, and something in his chest would do a small, complicated thing that he hadn't yet decided what to call. 14 receipts now, 14 Tuesdays, 14 small red hearts, each slightly different from the last. Some rounder, some more angular, one that was clearly drawn in a hurry because the right side was lower than the left. One that was so careful and deliberate it looked almost like calligraphy. He hadn't meant to memorize the differences between them. He just had. The two words beneath last week's heart, thank you, had not stopped running through his head. He didn't mention this to anyone. Not to Marcus, his COO, who had known him since graduate school and had a talent for asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. Not to his mother, who called every Sunday and had recently begun inserting the phrase, "It's okay to be happy again," into conversations where it didn't quite fit, with the particular determination of a woman who has decided something and will not be dissuaded. Not to Dr. Sato, whom he still saw once a month because that felt like more than he was ready to examine. He mentioned it, slightly accidentally, to Lily. It was a Thursday evening, 2 days after the last Tuesday, and Lily was sitting at the kitchen island doing something with crayons that had started as a drawing of their dog. They didn't have a dog. She just wanted one with a persistence that rivaled any negotiation Nathan had ever been in, and had evolved into what she described as a map of the city, but better. Nathan was making pasta because it was the one thing he could reliably make without burning it, and he'd been quiet for long enough that Lily had glanced up twice to check on him. "You're thinking loud," she said. "I'm not thinking out loud. I haven't said anything." "No, loud. You get a face," she demonstrated, pulling her own face into an expression of distracted blankness that was apparently her impression of him. It was more accurate than he'd have liked. He stirred the pasta. The receipt this week had something new on it. Lily immediately set down her orange crayon with the urgency of someone receiving important news. "What?" "She wrote thank you under the heart." Lily stared at him. "And?" "And nothing. That was it." "Dad." Her voice had the weight of deep personal suffering. "What did you do?" "I said goodnight and drove home." The look on Lily's face cycled through several stages of something before landing on resigned acceptance. "You're very smart about some things," she said carefully. But, she picked up the orange crayon again. "She wrote to you. On the paper. You're supposed to write back." "It was a receipt." "So?" "She drew something that might have been a river. It's still writing." Nathan drained the pasta and thought about this. He didn't tell Lily that he'd been thinking about exactly that for 2 days, about what writing back even meant, when the medium was a receipt from a coffee shop, about whether there was a version of that which wasn't completely absurd for a 32-year-old man who ran an international company, about whether it mattered that it was absurd. "She might not have meant anything by it," he said, mostly to the pasta. Lily didn't even look up. "She draws you a heart every single week, and you think she didn't mean anything. People draw things all the time." I draw things all the time. She held up the map that was better. This means something. Everything you draw means something. That's why you draw it. He put dinner on the table. Lily climbed into her chair and examined her plate with the critical eye she'd recently developed toward any food that wasn't exactly what she'd wanted. She's going to stop eventually, Lily said, in the tone of someone delivering a difficult truth with kindness. If you never say anything. Nathan looked at his daughter. That's what happens, she said. She stabbed a piece of pasta with her fork. When people try and nobody says anything back. He ate his dinner. He didn't argue with her because she was 5 years old and completely right. December came in cold and specific, the way New York City cold always does, not gradually, but like a door being slammed open, all wind and concrete chill and the particular quality of light that turns everything slightly blue by 4 in the afternoon. Nathan's office on the 38th floor became an aquarium of gray sky, and the city below moved faster the way it always did when the temperature dropped, everyone with somewhere to be and no patience for anything in between. Work, in December, was the particular kind of brutal that Nathan had learned to manage by treating it like weather. You didn't fight it, you just put on the right gear and got through it. The Singapore supplier issue from 2 weeks ago had resolved badly, meaning it had resolved on the supplier's terms, which meant restructuring 2 distribution agreements and having 3 conversations he'd been hoping to avoid. His board was pushing for an acquisition that Nathan thought was premature. His head of marketing wanted to rebrand one of the subsidiaries in a direction Nathan found aesthetically repellent but couldn't articulate a business argument against. He was flying to London in 10 days for a set of meetings that would take 72 hours and accomplish, in his estimate, about 40% of what they should. Tuesdays remained Tuesdays. He noticed in the first week of December that he'd started looking forward to them in a way that was slightly unnerving. Not because it was wrong, but because of how visceral it was. By Monday afternoon, he was already aware of Tuesday the way you're aware of something you've been waiting for. By Tuesday morning, he was impatient in a way that was hard to justify rationally and that he'd given up trying to. He thought about what Lily had said. She's going to stop eventually. He thought about it every day that week. He arrived at the café on the first Tuesday of December at 5:35 p.m., 5 minutes earlier than his early, carrying a tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with London or the board or the acquisition. The café had been decorated. Petros had strung small white lights along the front window and put a slightly bedraggled artificial wreath on the door, which managed to look both terrible and genuinely festive. Tommy was behind the counter alone, which meant Emma was in the back or it was her day off, and Nathan felt something drop in his stomach that he didn't acknowledge. Then she came through the back door carrying a box of paper cups, and the something in his stomach righted itself, which was information he filed away without examining. "Hey," she said, and started on his coffee without being asked. He sat in his booth. The lights along the window turned everything slightly golden, which the cafe needed, honestly. The overhead lights had always been a little harsh. He could hear holiday music coming from somewhere, though Petros had apparently made the executive decision to play a jazz version of everything, which softened it enough to be tolerable. Emma brought his coffee and lingered at the table for just a moment, not sitting, just standing with her hand on the back of the opposite bench in a way that suggested she was deciding something. "How's the week been?" she asked. It was the most personal question she'd asked him in 11 months. He looked up at her. "Long," he said. "Singapore, London coming up, the usual." She nodded, and something moved through her expression. Not quite recognition, but the particular attentiveness of someone who is actually listening rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. "You travel a lot?" "Not as much as I used to. I don't like to be away from—" He stopped. He didn't talk about Lily at the cafe. He'd kept those 2 parts of his life carefully separate, the way you keep things separate when you're not sure what category they belong to. "I don't like being away," he finished. Emma looked at him in the way she sometimes did, steady, thoughtful, like she was adding something to a picture she'd been building for a while. "I've never been to London," she said. "It's cold in December." "So is here." "True, but the coffee's worse." A genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes before it reached her mouth. "That feels like a personal attack on the British." It's a statistical fact. She laughed. A short, real laugh, not the customer service approximation she used when she was being polite. It was the first time he'd heard her actually laugh, and it was, objectively, an excellent laugh. He filed that away too. She went back to the counter. He sat with his coffee and watched the lights along the window and thought about nothing useful and everything important. Over the next hour, the cafe did its slow evening cycling. People came in, ordered, left, were replaced by others. Tommy made mistakes and corrected them and made new ones. Petros emerged twice from the kitchen, once to adjust something behind the counter, and once seemingly just to stand in the cafe and appreciate his own holiday decorating, which Nathan found quietly delightful. At one point, in the lull between 6 and 6:30, Emma leaned against the counter near his booth, not close enough to be intrusive, just in the general vicinity. And they talked in the way that happens when neither person has planned to talk, but the silence has reached a point where words feel easier. They talked about December, about the particular exhaustion of the last month of the year. Emma mentioned that she was working double shifts most of the week because one of the other employees had a family emergency. And she said it the way people say things when they're tired. Not complaining, just reporting, the way you describe weather. Nathan noticed she hadn't mentioned her own plans for the holidays and chose not to ask. Not yet. She mentioned briefly that she'd been in the city for 4 years, which answered the geographical question he'd been quietly carrying. She was from a small town in Ohio, near Columbus, which explained the occasional different inflection. She'd come to the city for reasons she kept general, in the way people keep things general when the specific version is too heavy for a Tuesday evening. She'd stayed because, and here she paused just slightly, because it was easier to be busy here. You could fill a day in the city and not notice what you weren't thinking about. Nathan understood this more than he'd wanted to. He didn't say so. But something in the quality of his listening must have communicated it, because she glanced at him in the middle of what she was saying and stopped, and a small silence passed between them that was different from the previous silences, fuller somehow, more aware of itself. "You know what I mean," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah," he said. "I do." She looked at him for a moment in that steady way of hers. Then Tommy called something from the register that required her attention, and the moment closed, the way moments do, without fanfare. When she brought his receipt, she set it on the table, and then, instead of walking away, she sat down across from him. The second time she'd done this, quick and decided, like jumping into cold water. "I want to tell you something," she said. Nathan set down his cup. "Okay." "The hearts." She folded her hands on the table. Her right index finger still had the ink stain, he noticed. "You've never asked about them." "No." "I've been waiting for you to." "I know." She looked slightly surprised. "You knew I was waiting?" "I suspected." He held her gaze. "I didn't know how to ask without. I didn't want to make it into something it wasn't, or something you didn't want it to be." Emma was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, then back at him. "My brother used to do it," she said. Her voice was even, careful. "Draw little hearts on everything. Notes, napkins, whatever was nearby. He said his 4th grade teacher had done it once, drawn a heart on his homework when he was having a rough week, and he never forgot it. He thought it was the smallest possible way to tell someone they weren't invisible." Nathan didn't say anything. He let the silence do what it needed to do. "He died 4 years ago," Emma said. "Car accident." She said it the way you say something you've said many times. Not without weight, but with the particular flatness that comes from carrying weight so long it's shaped itself to you. "He was 24. "I'm sorry," Nathan said. She nodded. Not dismissively, just the nod of someone who has heard those words enough times to have made peace with the inadequacy of them. "The first time you came in," she said, "you sat in that booth for almost 2 hours. You looked like—" She paused, choosing carefully. "You looked like someone trying to remember how to breathe. And I don't know why exactly. You just reminded me of him, not what he looked like, just the—" She gestured vaguely, searching for the word. "The quality of it," Nathan said. "Yeah." She looked slightly relieved that she hadn't had to finish the sentence. and I drew the heart without really thinking about it. It was automatic, like muscle memory. A pause. And then you came back. I came back. And you never said anything about the heart, and I thought, okay, he didn't notice, so I drew another one, because it felt like something Daniel would have wanted me to do. She said the name quietly, and he understood it was the first time she'd said her brother's name to him. He would have liked you. Something moved in Nathan's chest that he couldn't have named precisely. Anyway, Emma said, with the slight shift in tone that signals a person collecting themselves, I've drawn one every week because it started as Daniel, and then it kept being something. I'm not entirely sure what, but I wanted you to know where it started, since you never asked. A faint, slightly wry look. I think you were being polite. I was being a coward, Nathan said. She blinked. You gave me something every week, and I kept it. He stopped. He hadn't meant to say that last part. Emma was very still. You kept them. He hadn't planned to say this tonight. He hadn't planned to say it at all, in any kind of timeline he'd imagined. But Lily's voice was in his head. She's going to stop eventually. And Emma's eyes were across the table from him, and she'd just said her brother's name. All of them, he said. A long silence. Everyone? She asked. From the first. Emma looked at him. Her expression was doing something complicated, and she wasn't completely managing to keep it still, which was the first time in months he'd seen her composure actually slip. She pressed her lips together for a moment, then, why? I don't know, he said, which was true. At first I think I wasn't ready to throw them away, and then they became something I didn't want to throw away. And then, he stopped. I kept them. She looked down at the table. Something was working through her face, and he gave her the room to work through it, the same way she'd always given him room without demanding anything in return. Okay, she said finally. Okay? I don't know what else to say. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of that was visible. I'm glad you told me. I'm glad you told me about Daniel. A quiet settled over the table. Not an uncomfortable one, the kind that has substance to it, that means something has been said and both people are letting it land. Emma slid out of the booth and stood. She straightened her apron, which didn't need straightening. She glanced at him once more. You come here every Tuesday, she said. It wasn't quite a statement, not quite a question. Every Tuesday, he confirmed. Something moved across her face, something small and carefully contained, but there. Good, she said, and went back to the counter. Nathan sat with the receipt in front of him, unread, for a long time. He unfolded it eventually. The heart was there, the same as always. Nothing else beneath it tonight. No words, no addition, just the heart. But it felt different now. It meant what it had always meant, and also something more. Something he didn't quite have language for yet, but was beginning to understand the shape of. He folded it and put it in his pocket with his hands that weren't entirely steady. He flew to London this following week and hated it the way he'd predicted, minus 10%, because the meetings were worse than he'd expected and the coffee was exactly as bad as he'd told Emma it would be. And he spent 3 days thinking about a cafe in the western part of the city with cracked booth vinyl and bad overhead lighting and a woman who drew small red hearts on paper. He texted Marcus from his hotel room at midnight London time. How's the Singapore situation? Marcus replied, handled. Go to sleep. You look terrible on video calls. He didn't go to sleep for a while. He lay on the hotel bed looking at the ceiling of a room that cost $800 a night and thought about Ohio and about a fourth-grade teacher who'd drawn a heart on a child's homework and about the ways people carry grief without setting it down. He thought about Daniel, whom he'd never met, who had apparently seen the quiet sadness in strangers and decided the right response was to draw small hearts. He thought he would have liked him too. He came home on a Friday and Lily launched herself at him from the hallway the way she always did, and he held on for longer than usual, and she didn't complain about it. He asked if she'd been good. She said mostly. He said that was fair. Saturday morning, over cereal, she looked at him with her analytical eyes. You seem different, she said. Different how? She ate a spoonful of cereal and considered. Less far away. she said eventually. He thought about that for the rest of the weekend. The following Tuesday, December 17th, Nathan arrived at 5:30 p.m., his earliest yet, and didn't try to pretend that was accidental. The cafe was warm against the outside cold, the holiday lights along the window doing their golden work, Petros's jazz Christmas playlist doing its muffled best from the back speaker. Tommy was getting better at his job, Nathan had noticed over the weeks. Fewer mishaps, more confidence, though he'd recently developed a habit of narrating his own drink-making process under his breath that Emma had not yet found a polite way to address. Emma looked up when he came in. They hadn't talked since the conversation about Daniel. There'd been no way to. He'd been in London, and the distance had given the conversation a kind of preservation, like something kept in a glass case. But now he was back, and she was here, and the week had happened. And when their eyes met across the cafe, there was a different quality to it than before. Not uncomfortable, just aware. Two people who now know something about each other that changes the geometry of the space between them. She made his coffee. He sat in his booth. The usual choreography, except nothing was quite the same. The way a familiar song played in a different key is still recognizable, but isn't what you expected. She brought his coffee and stood at the table for a moment. She didn't sit. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when she was deciding something. "How was London?" she said. "Cold. Worse coffee than here." "You said that would happen." "I'm reliably correct about certain things." The corner of her mouth moved. She glanced out the window at the street where the December darkness had settled early and the passing headlights made the snow. It had started to snow, lightly, flicker gold and white. She looked back at him. "I've been thinking about what you said." "Which part?" "You kept all of them." She said it quietly, not accusingly, just the way you say something you've been sitting with. "Yes? That's a lot of receipts to hold on to." 14, he said, as of last week. Emma looked at him for a moment. "You counted." "I didn't mean to." She nodded slowly. The honesty of that, the unguardedness of admitting you'd counted something you hadn't meant to count, seemed to do something to her. She shifted her weight, glanced back at Tommy, who was ostentatiously wiping down a very clean counter to give them space, and then looked at Nathan with an expression that was the most undefended he'd seen on her face. "I've been drawing them longer than you've been coming in," she said. "There was someone before you, a man who used to sit in that same booth a few years back, lost his job, came in every day for 3 weeks straight and just sat there. I drew hearts on his receipts." She paused. "He cried once, just a little, in a way he thought nobody saw. I pretended not to see it." Nathan was very still. I'm not saying it's the same thing," Emma said. "He wasn't the same. It was just a kindness. But you." She stopped. She looked somewhere past his shoulder for a moment, then back. "After a few weeks, it stopped being just a kindness, and I didn't have a name for what else it was, so I just kept drawing them." The cafe was quiet around them. Even the jazz playlist seemed to have paused, though it probably hadn't. "Emma," Nathan said. She looked at him. "I'd like to know your last name," he said. It was not what she expected him to say. She blinked. "You already know it. It's on my name tag." "Your name tag says Emma, that's it." She looked down at her name tag, apparently having forgotten this. "Brooks," she said. "Emma Brooks." Nathan Sterling. He held out his hand with a formality that was almost absurd given 11 months of Tuesdays. She looked at his hand. Then she shook it, brief and warm, and he held on for exactly 1 beat longer than a handshake requires, and she didn't pull away immediately. "I know who you are," she said, when their hands dropped. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I Googled you," she said, entirely without apology. "After the 3rd Tuesday. I was curious." He didn't know why this surprised him. "And you're a very important person, apparently." She said it with the particular tone of someone who has assessed this information and decided it is mostly irrelevant. "Forbes magazine seems very interested in what you do." "Forbes is interested in my net worth. That's different from being interested in me." She considered this. Fair, she said. Then carefully, your daughter, she's 5? He was quiet for a moment. You read about Claire. I'm sorry. And she meant it. Not the reflexive social apology, but the real thing, offered simply, without decoration. I'm sorry that happened to you. He looked at the table. Her name is Lily. She's... He thought about how to describe Lily and landed where he always did, slightly inadequate. She's the most opinionated person I've ever met, and I've been in rooms with heads of state. Emma's expression softened. How old was she? 18 months? He picked up his coffee cup, set it down. She doesn't remember Claire. Which is, I don't know if that's easier or harder. I can't decide. Both, Emma said quietly. He looked at her. Something in the way she said it, with the knowledge of someone who has had to hold two opposite truths at once, made him want to ask. But he didn't. Some things you wait for. Both, he agreed. She straightened. I have to go check on Tommy before he begins narrating the entire espresso process to the next customer. Does he do that? He did it to a woman this morning for 4 full minutes. She was very polite about it. I wasn't. Nathan almost laughed. Almost. It caught somewhere and didn't quite make it out, but Emma saw it anyway, and her eyes did something warm. She went back to the counter. He sat with his coffee and the snow outside and the gold lights along the window and thought about 14 receipts in a drawer and a woman who'd been drawing hearts longer than he'd been receiving them, and the particular, almost unbearable tenderness of finding out that something you thought was just for you had a whole history before you arrived. He thought about Lily, who was home right now with her babysitter, probably still lobbying for a dog. He thought about the map that was better than the regular city map. He thought about the way children understand certain things before adults do, because they haven't yet learned all the reasons to be afraid. He thought, Tuesday is not enough. He didn't know what to do with that thought yet. But he had it, clearly and completely, and he put it somewhere he wouldn't lose it, and he watched the snow fall in the window's golden light, and he let the evening be what it was. When she brought his receipt, she was already walking away when he unfolded it. The heart. And beneath it, for the second time, words, 3 of them, in the small red ink. Welcome back, Nathan. He sat with that for a long time. The drawer in his nightstand was going to need more room. The week between Tuesdays had started to feel longer than it used to. Nathan noticed this the way you notice a change in the weather before you can see it. A low-level awareness, a restlessness that hadn't been there before. He'd always been good at compartmentalizing, at keeping the different chambers of his life from bleeding into each other. Work was work. Home was Lily. Tuesdays were Tuesdays. The system had functioned well enough for almost 3 years, and he told himself that functioning was the same as living, or close enough that the difference didn't matter. He was beginning to understand that the difference mattered considerably. It was a Thursday evening, 4 days after the last Tuesday, and he was sitting in his office on the 38th floor long after everyone else had gone home. The city spread out below him in its winter darkness, all those lit windows, all those lives happening at exactly the same time in parallel, and he had a contract open on his laptop and a glass of water he hadn't touched, and absolutely no ability to focus on either of them. Welcome back, Nathan. He'd read those 3 words approximately 80 times since Tuesday. He hadn't meant to count that either. He pulled up his messages and typed to Marcus. Do you think I'm bad at talking to people? Marcus replied 11 minutes later, which suggested he'd had to think about it. You're excellent at talking to people when you want something. Why? Nathan stared at that for a while, then put his phone face down on the desk. He knew what he wanted. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the specific arithmetic of wanting something when you've already lost something, the way grief does its quiet math on every decision that comes after, dividing your confidence, multiplying your caution, leaving you standing in the doorway of something good with your hand on the frame, unable to make yourself walk through. Claire had been easy. That was the word he always came back to, and he always felt guilty about it because easy sounded diminishing, and it wasn't meant to be. He meant that with Claire, everything had moved in a direction that made sense. They'd met in graduate school, become friends, become more, moved in together, gotten married, had Lily. Each step had felt like the next logical step. There had been disagreements and stretches where the work consumed too much of both of them, and a fight about Thanksgiving one year that had lasted 3 days and resolved badly, and all the ordinary friction of two people making a life together. But the direction had always been clear. He didn't know the direction now. He barely knew the terrain. What he knew was Emma Brooks, of Columbus, Ohio, by way of 4 years in this city, who kept a red pen in her apron pocket and worked double shifts without complaining, and had a dead brother named Daniel and an ex-boyfriend named Ryan, who showed up uninvited and thought persistence was the same as love. He knew she drew him a heart every Tuesday. He knew she'd been drawing them before he arrived. He knew that Welcome Back, Nathan had cost her something to write, the same way his I Kept Them All had cost him something to say, and that those two things were in conversation with each other in a language neither of them had fully named yet. He closed the laptop. He went home. Lily was asleep, and he stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, listening to her breathe, which was still, even now, the most reliably calming thing in his life. He went to his own room and opened the nightstand drawer. 16 receipts. He'd started putting them in chronological order without consciously deciding to. He picked up the most recent one. Read the 3 words again. Folded it back exactly as it had been. Tuesday, he thought. 4 more days. He turned off the light. Christmas came and went in the specific way it does when you're a single parent, with a great deal of effort and a sincere desire to make it good, and the knowledge that some of the happiness you're performing is real and some of it is for the child in front of you, and you can't always tell which is which. Nathan's parents had come to the city, which he was grateful for, and which also meant 3 days of his mother looking at him with the particular combination of love and worry that parents never fully stop wearing on their faces regardless of how old you get. His father had been quieter, more careful, the way he always was now, as if Claire's death had recalibrated something in him about what was worth saying. Lily had gotten a stuffed rabbit for Christmas, which she named Gerald, and which immediately displaced Kevin the elephant as the primary sleep companion, though Kevin remained on the pillow in an advisory role. She'd asked Santa, via a letter that Nathan had helped her spell but absolutely not written, for a dog. Santa had written back. Nathan had absolutely not written this letter either, explaining that the apartment building had rules, but that maybe with time and some further lobbying of her father, the situation might evolve. Lily had shown Nathan the letter with a look that said she knew exactly what was going on and found it only mildly insulting. He liked her so much. He didn't always have language for it. The love was a given, automatic as breathing, but the liking was something separate and specific. This admiration for the particular human she was becoming, all that clarity and stubbornness, and the way she cared about things with her whole self and didn't apologize for it. He wished Claire could see her. That was the thing about grief, the specific arithmetic of it. It didn't go away. It just found new occasions. Every developmental milestone, every funny thing Lily said, every morning she climbed into his bed at 6:30 and demanded cereal. All of it was wonderful, and all of it was shadowed by the absence of the person who should also be here for it. He'd said this to Dr. Sato once, and she'd nodded and said, "Grief isn't a place you leave. It's a place you learn to live near." He'd thought about that for a long time. He thought it was right, but incomplete. What she hadn't said, what he was only now beginning to understand, was that learning to live near it doesn't mean you can't live somewhere else entirely at the same time. The cafe was closed Christmas week. He'd known it would be. He'd told himself he was fine with this. He was mostly fine with this. The first Tuesday of January arrived with ice on the streets and a clarity in the air that cold weather sometimes produces. Everything sharper, more defined, the city stripped of the softness that snow adds and left with its actual bones. Nathan drove to Hollow Creek and parked and sat in the car for approximately 30 seconds before deciding he was being ridiculous and going inside. Emma was there. She was in the middle of arguing with the coffee grinder, which appeared to be losing the argument. Tommy was watching her from a safe distance with the expression of someone who had offered help and been declined. She looked up when the bell rang. Something crossed her face. Relief, or its close cousin, and then was contained. "Happy New Year," she said. "You too." He stamped the ice off his boots. "Rough start?" "The grinder's being terrible." She smacked the side of it, which produced a grinding noise followed by silence. 2 weeks without use, and it's decided it has opinions. Maybe it missed you. She looked at the machine with the expression of someone who is not moved by this argument. It's going to miss my foot in a minute. She tried the switch again. The grinder stuttered and then, apparently out of spite, began working normally. Emma looked at it for a beat, then at Nathan. It always does this. The grinder specifically, or things in general, she said, and went to make his coffee. Things wait until I'm at my most exhausted to start cooperating. It's a personal philosophy of the universe directed at me specifically. I don't think the universe is organized enough to have a personal philosophy. You've clearly never worked a double shift on New Year's Eve and had the dishwasher break at 11:30 p.m. He sat in his booth. The cafe looked the same as always, which was a comfort he hadn't anticipated needing. The holiday lights were still in the window. Petros had apparently decided January 1st was too early to take them down, a decision Nathan supported. She brought his coffee and sat across from him, and this had become a thing they did now. This sitting, though it was never planned and never lasted long and always felt slightly like something held in cupped hands. He'd noticed she chose the moments when Tommy was occupied and Petros was in the back, giving herself a buffer of plausible deniability that neither of them mentioned. "How was your Christmas?" she asked. "Good. Loud. My parents were here." He paused. "My mother started talking about next Christmas before this one was over." "Planners," Emma said, with the tone of someone who has experienced this. "She's been a planner since before I was born. I think she came out of the womb with a color-coded calendar." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "How was yours?" A brief pause. "The kind that has something in it." "Quiet," she said. Then, in a slightly different register, "I went home to Ohio for 4 days, first time in 2 years." He waited. It was... She turned her coffee cup on the table. Not her coffee, just a motion her hands needed. "My parents are in the same house. Everything's exactly the same. Daniel's room is exactly the same." She said her brother's name more easily now, with him, than she had that first night. He noticed this and felt the weight of what it meant. "My mom still sets a place for him at dinner. She doesn't talk about it. She just does it." Nathan was quiet. 4 years, Emma said, and the plate is still there. She stopped rotating the cup. "I don't know if that's beautiful or—" She didn't finish. "Both," he said. She looked at him. The echo of their conversation in December, the word she'd given him, returned, landed between them, and she recognized it, and something in her face went soft in a way she immediately tried to rein in but didn't quite manage. "Yeah," she said. "Both." They sat with that for a moment. "Lily left a space on the table too," Nathan said. He hadn't planned to say it. "The first Christmas without Claire, she was 2.5. She didn't understand exactly. She'd ask where Mama was, and I'd try to explain, and she'd accept it the way small kids accept things they don't fully understand, and then 10 minutes later she'd ask again." He looked at the table. "She stopped asking around her 3rd birthday. I didn't know whether to be relieved or wrecked." "Wrecked," Emma said quietly. Not a question. "Yeah." Another silence, but not empty. Full of the specific weight of 2 people who have each been carrying something alone for long enough that the presence of someone who understands, without requiring explanation, feels like putting down a bag you'd forgotten you were holding. Tommy dropped something behind the counter. They both looked up. He waved apologetically. They looked back at each other, and Emma's mouth moved in what was almost a smile, and Nathan felt something in his chest do what it always did lately, in her vicinity. That complicated, slightly alarming thing he'd stopped trying to name. "I should—" she started. "I know." She slid out of the booth. At the edge of the table she stopped, and without looking at him directly said, "I'm glad you were here when I got back." He looked up at her. She was looking at the counter, already moving back toward it, and he let her go without making her look at him. "I'm glad you were here too," he said. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders did something. He counted that. January moved the way January always does in the city, with determination and very little warmth, everyone's good intentions from New Year's grinding against the reality of February approaching. Nathan's board pushed through the acquisition he'd had doubts about, and he spent 3 weeks making it work because that was what you did when the vote didn't go your way. You made it work, and you kept your reservations to yourself and showed everyone else how to execute. His London meetings had produced exactly the 40% yield he'd predicted. He promoted Tommy's replacement. Tommy had been promoted to something resembling a shift lead, which Emma had communicated with the tone of someone who is proud and also slightly terrified. Tuesdays were still Tuesdays. The conversations had grown longer, easier, the way conversations do when the people having them have stopped being careful about taking up too much space. Emma told him about Ohio in pieces, the small town, the high school where she and Daniel had both played soccer, the particular quality of Midwestern summer evenings that she missed in a way the city never quite filled. He told her about the company in pieces, the early years, the startup years, the years when Marcus and he had worked out of a 2-room office and paid themselves in increments that barely covered rent. She asked questions that were specific, not impressed by wealth questions, but actually curious ones. She wanted to know what he liked about it, not what it had produced, but what he actually liked day to day. He'd had to think about that one. The problems, he said eventually. There's always a problem that hasn't been solved yet. I like that. You like problems. I like the moment before you solve them. When you can see all the pieces, but the solution isn't clear yet. He paused. It's like, you know there's an answer. You just haven't found the angle yet. And when you find it, everything reorganizes. Emma looked at him steadily. That sounds like you're describing something other than business. He held her gaze. Maybe. She looked away first, but she was almost smiling. He'd told Lily about Emma in more detail now. Not about the receipts specifically, Lily already knew about those, but about the conversations, the way Tuesday evenings had become something he oriented his week around. Lily had listened with the focused attention of someone taking notes, which, knowing Lily, she possibly was, somewhere in her head. Does she know about me? Lily had asked. She knows I have a daughter. Does she know my name? Lily. That's a yes. She'd nodded, satisfied. Good. I want her to know my name. He hadn't known what to do with that, so he'd made pasta. Mtik. The last Tuesday of January was unremarkable in every way until it wasn't. Nathan arrived at 5:42 p.m. The cafe was in its usual early evening configuration. A few customers, Tommy behind the register, Petros doing something with a new pastry that he'd been describing for 3 weeks as revolutionary and had not yet produced. Emma was at the far end of the counter, and she glanced up when he came in with the small, specific expression that had become his. He sat in his booth. She brought his coffee. She was about to say something. He could see it in the way she'd paused, weight shifted toward him slightly, when the door opened. Nathan knew before he looked up. Something in Emma's face said it first. Ryan Keller. He was dressed better than the last time. Coat instead of a jacket, something deliberate about it, as if he'd thought about this visit in advance, which he clearly had. He looked around the cafe with the quick assessment of a man who has been rehearsing something and is checking the staging. His eyes found Emma. He smiled, and the smile was the kind that probably worked on people who hadn't seen it enough times to recognize the effort beneath it. Hey, Em. The same greeting as before, casual as if no months had passed. As if the last time she'd said his name, she'd been dismissing him from her workplace. I know. He held up a hand. I'm not here to start anything. I've been thinking about what you said last time. And I wanted to talk, properly. Not like that. Emma had gone very still. She was holding a coffee cloth that she did not need, and her hands were not quite tense, but close to it. Ryan, she said. And even that single syllable had the flatness of something that's been eroded by repetition. This isn't the place. It's never the place. He said it without heat, but there was an edge under it. The frustration of someone who's been patient in the way people are patient when they believe patience will eventually produce the result they want. You don't return calls. You don't, because I don't have anything to say on the phone that I haven't already said in person. You haven't said enough in person. You've just shut the door. He took a step closer to the counter. Tommy, to his credit, had positioned himself about 3 feet away from Emma with a slightly terrified alertness of someone who's trying to decide if this is a situation that requires him to do something. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I'm past asking for that. I just want to explain. There are things you don't know about that night. Emma's jaw moved. A small thing, but Nathan saw it. I know everything about that night that I need to know, she said. You don't. Ryan's voice was lower now, more urgent. He leaned against the counter in the way he had before, that posture that declared entitlement to the space. Emma, your brother, don't. The word came out with a force that stopped Ryan mid-sentence. Her voice was still quiet, but the quiet had an edge in it now, the specific edge of someone who has reached the bottom of something. Don't say his name. Not here. Not to me. A silence fell over the cafe with the particular weight of a room that has stopped pretending not to listen. Nathan was already out of the booth. He didn't make a production of it. He simply stood up, walked to the counter, and placed himself slightly to Emma's left. Not between them, not confrontationally, just present. Physically present. A body in a space that said, without saying anything, she is not alone. Ryan looked at him. The calculation in that look was quick and thorough. Who is this? What's his relationship to Emma? What does his presence here mean? Nathan met it without expression. Who's this? Ryan said. A customer, Emma said. He doesn't look like he's getting coffee. Ryan. Emma's voice had steadied again, the way it always did, that bedrock quality that Nathan had come to recognize as one of the truest things about her. She looked at Ryan directly. I've told you this before. I'm telling you again. I don't want to have this conversation. Not today, not next week, not at some better time you're imagining. There isn't a better time. Because you won't give me one. Because there isn't one to give. She set the coffee cloth down. What happened to Daniel? I know you didn't mean it. I know that. I stopped blaming you for not meaning it a long time ago. Her voice was steady, completely steady, and Nathan could only imagine what that cost her. But you were drunk. You made that choice. And Daniel died. And saying you're sorry for 3 years doesn't put those two facts in different order. Ryan's face had changed. The practiced ease had gone out of it, leaving something more honest underneath. So, not malicious, just worn. I think about him every day, he said. I know you do. Emma's voice was quieter now. And I think that's why you keep coming back, because you need something from me. Some version of forgiveness that makes it smaller, that lets you carry it differently. She paused. But I can't give you that. And it's not because I'm being cruel. It's because I don't have it to give. I'm still working on the weight of it myself. You wanting me to take your weight too isn't something I can do. The honesty of it settled over the room like cold air. Ryan stood at the counter with his rehearsed conversation in pieces around him, looking at a woman who had just told him something true that he hadn't prepared for. I'm not trying to put it on you, he said, but it was quieter now, less certain. I know you're not trying to, but you are. She held his gaze. I think you should see someone, Ryan, genuinely. Not because you're bad. You're not bad. But you need to put this down somewhere, and I can't be that place. A long silence. Ryan looked at Nathan again. Something moved through his face, a recognition maybe, or something close to it. The recognition of someone who can see what he's looking at, even if he doesn't want to say it. He looked back at Emma. Is he... He gestured vaguely. That's not the conversation we're having, Emma said. Ryan exhaled slowly. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. The performance had gone entirely now. He just looked tired. I just wanted you to know I was sorry, he said, and this time it landed differently. Not the apology he'd been rehearsing, but something underneath it, the real one. I know, Emma said, quieter. I've always known that. He nodded once. He looked at Nathan for a moment, not confrontationally, just looking. Then he turned and walked out. The door swung shut. Nobody in the cafe spoke for a beat. Tommy let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for several minutes. Petros appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the situation, and disappeared again with the wisdom of a man who knows when to let things breathe. Emma stood at the counter with her hands flat on the surface, looking at the door. Nathan was still beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't move to go back to his booth. He just stayed where he was. After a moment, she said, without looking at him, Thank you. I didn't do anything. You stood up. She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite tears, but was in the same neighborhood. The particular brightness of someone who has held themselves completely together through something and is now processing the cost of that. That was enough. He looked at her. She looked at him. The cafe hummed around them quietly, pretending to be a normal cafe. Emma, he said, don't. Her voice was gentle, not dismissive. Give me a minute. I need a minute. Okay. She turned and went to the back. He went back to his booth and sat down and looked at his coffee, which had gone cold, and didn't think about anything in particular for the next 3 minutes. When she came back, she'd clearly washed her face, and her eyes were dry, and she was carrying a fresh coffee that she set in front of him without comment. She looked like herself, or like the version of herself that the cafe got, which he was increasingly aware was only one version, and that the other versions existed behind it and were not yet available to him, and that this was something he wanted to change. That was the last time he'll come here, she said. How do you know? Because I finally said the true thing, not the managed thing. The true thing. She looked at the door. I've been giving him the managed version for 2 years. Tonight I didn't have enough left in me to manage it. She glanced at Nathan. Sometimes you need to run out of the careful version before you can say the real one. He thought about 16 receipts in a nightstand drawer, about himself in this booth for 11 months, caring about something and saying nothing. He thought, I don't want to run out of the careful version before I say the real one. I need to tell you something, he said. Emma looked at him. Not tonight, he said. Tonight you've had enough. But soon. He held her gaze. There are things I've been saying carefully when I could be saying them truly, and I think I'd like to try the true version. She was quiet for a moment. The something that moved through her face was too quick and too layered for him to name all of it. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay. She picked up his old cup and replaced it with the new one. Her hand, as she set it down, brushed his, and she didn't move it immediately, and neither did he. And for exactly 2 seconds they both stayed perfectly still. Then she straightened. Drink your coffee before it gets cold again, she said. That's the second cup. Your fault for letting the first one go. She went back to the counter. He sat with the warmth of the cup and the warmth of something else, something harder to hold and more important, and he turned it over carefully in his mind the way you turn over something that you don't want to break. He thought about what she'd said. Sometimes you need to run out of the careful version before you can say the real one. He thought about the fact that he had been saying the careful version of himself for 3 years. Careful grief, careful work, careful fatherhood, careful Tuesday evenings that stayed inside their careful category. He thought he might be very close to the edge of the careful version now. The receipt came at the end of the evening, and this time Emma set it on the table and then stood there for a moment, something uncertain in her posture, which was unusual. Emma was rarely uncertain in her body, even when her words were careful. I meant what I said, she told him. What you did tonight, standing there. She looked at the table rather than at him. It mattered. I wanted you to know it mattered. It was easy, he said. You made it easy by being who you are. She looked up at that. Something moved through her face. Good night, Nathan, she said. Good night, Emma. He waited until she'd walked away before unfolding the receipt. The heart was there. And beneath it, in the red ink, the words she'd written while he was gathering his coat and not watching. I think I'm ready for the true version, too. He read it twice. His hands weren't steady. He folded the receipt, but slowly, carefully, the way you handle something you already know you'll keep forever, and tucked it inside his jacket pocket, close to where his heart was doing something complicated and necessary, and for the first time in 3 years, not entirely afraid. He drove home that night with the receipt in his jacket pocket, and the heat turned up too high, and the radio playing something he wasn't listening to. And somewhere on the bridge over the river, he realized his hands had finally stopped being unsteady. That felt significant. He wasn't sure in what direction yet, but significant. The nightstand drawer now held 17 receipts. He'd stopped pretending he wasn't counting. He'd also, sometime in the last few weeks, stopped thinking of the drawer as a secret and started thinking of it as a record. The way certain people keep journals not to process their feelings, but simply to document that something happened, that it was real, that the days accumulated into something that mattered. The receipts were his record of Tuesdays, of Emma, of the slow, ungraceful, completely unplanned process of a man who had decided he was done with one kind of life, discovering that another kind had been available all along, waiting in a corner booth with burned espresso and cracked vinyl and a woman who kept a red pen in her apron. I think I'm ready for the true version too. He read those words in his head approximately 90 times over the following week, which was at least consistent with his established pattern. The problem was not knowing what the true version looked like in practice. He knew what it felt like internally. That loosening in the chest, that specific quality of attention he had only in Emma's presence, the way Tuesday evenings left him different from how they'd found him. But feeling something and knowing how to move with it were, he'd learned, two different skills, and he was considerably more practiced at the first than the second. He talked to Marcus on Wednesday, which he hadn't fully planned, but which happened the way certain conversations do. Over coffee in Marcus's office, during a break between calls, when the guard comes down because you're too tired to maintain it. "There's someone," Nathan said. Marcus looked at him over his cup. He didn't say anything, which was one of the things Nathan had always valued about him, the ability to wait. "At the cafe I go to, on Tuesdays. The neighborhood place." "Yeah." Marcus put his cup down. "How long?" "Since I started going. Almost a year." "And you're just now?" "I'm just now," Nathan confirmed. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside his office, the company moved at its usual pace. Phones, keyboards, the low murmur of people solving problems with other people's money. "Is she good?" he asked finally. It was the right question. Not who is she or what does she do or any of the demographic questions that people reflexively reach for. Just, is she good? Nathan sat with it for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She's genuinely good." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then what are you still sitting here for?" Nathan almost said it's complicated, which was the true answer, but also the coward's answer, the answer that used accuracy as a hiding place. Instead, he said, "I don't know how to do this differently than last time, and last time was its own thing," Marcus said, not dismissively, just firmly. "You can't do it the same way. She's not Claire. You're not the same person you were. The whole math is different." "I know. So stop trying to solve for the same answer." Nathan looked at his coffee. He'd gone cold again. That kept happening lately, coffee going cold while he sat and thought, which probably said something about the balance of his inner and outer lives that he didn't have time to fully examine. "Lily likes her," he said. "She hasn't met her, but she likes her." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Lily has opinions about someone she hasn't met?" "Lily has opinions about everything. This is not new information." A slow smile crossed Marcus's face, the particular smile of a man who has known Nathan for 15 years and has been waiting, without saying so, for precisely this conversation. "Bring her coffee," he said. "What?" "To the cafe. Go in with coffee from somewhere else as a joke, see what she does. Or," he waved a hand, "I don't know, I'm not a romantic, but do something. Stop sitting in the booth every Tuesday having feelings at her without saying anything." "I've been saying things." "You said you kept the receipts. That's not nothing." "It's also not dinner, Nathan." Nathan sat with this. It was irritatingly reasonable. "She gets off at 7 on Tuesdays," he said. He hadn't told Marcus he knew this. He hadn't told anyone he knew this. Marcus looked at him steadily. "Then be there at 7. Well, he spent the rest of the week not overthinking it, which was itself a form of overthinking. He thought about what Marcus had said, "Do something," and about what Emma had written on the receipt, and about the 17 Tuesdays behind them, and whatever number lay ahead, and he arrived at a simple conclusion that had taken him considerably longer than it should have. He was going to ask her to dinner, not as a cafe customer asking a barista, not with any of the specific awkwardness of a man who has attached complicated feelings to someone across a counter for a year. Just dinner. One person asking another person if they'd like to share a meal. The simplest possible version of a thing that people did every day without making it into a philosophical exercise. He was going to be normal about it. He'd decided. He told Lily. She was in the bath when he told her, which he chose because she couldn't run around the apartment yelling if she was in the bath. She received the information with the frozen intensity of someone who has been waiting for news from a war front. "You're going to ask her to dinner," she repeated. "Yes." "This Tuesday?" "Yes." Lily processed this. Gerald the rabbit was sitting on the bathroom counter, an unlikely witness to the moment. "What if she says no?" Lily asked. "Then she says no." "Would you stop going to the café?" He thought about this. "No, I'd still go on Tuesdays." "Because of the coffee?" "Because—" He looked at his daughter's serious, bath-damp face. "Because she's my friend, and that matters regardless of the other thing." Lily considered this with the rigor she applied to most important questions. "Okay," she said, "but she's not going to say no." "You don't know that." "I know that she draws you a heart every week." She picked up the bottle of strawberry shampoo. "That's not what you do for someone you're going to say no to." He helped her wash her hair and thought that 5-year-olds should not be this perceptive, and also that he was grateful, specifically and continually, for this one. Tuesday arrived the way things arrive when you've been waiting for them, all at once, slightly before you're ready. Nathan left the office at 5, which was earlier than usual and involved deflecting 2 things that could have waited until tomorrow. He drove carefully through February streets where the ice had thinned but not gone, where the city was in the specific mood of late winter, not quite done with the cold but visibly tired of it, ready for something to change. He sat in the car outside Hollow Creek for approximately 90 seconds before deciding he was again being ridiculous and went inside. The cafe was warm. The holiday lights were gone now. Petros had finally taken them down the previous week, apparently with some ceremony. But someone had put small potted plants in the window instead, which looked like they might be herbs, but Nathan couldn't identify them from the door. The jazz playlist had evolved into something with more piano in it lately, which he preferred without having said so. Emma was behind the counter. She saw him come in and held up one finger, the gesture he knew now as well as his own name, and finished with the customer she was helping. Tommy was on register. A woman Nathan vaguely recognized from previous Tuesdays was eating a pastry near the window with a paperback open in front of her, in the specifically contented posture of someone having exactly the afternoon they wanted. Emma came to his booth while he was still taking off his coat. She had his coffee already, and she set it on the table and looked at him in a way that was different from their usual exchange, more aware of itself, as if the last Tuesday's receipt had changed the angle of everything, which of course it had. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She slid into the booth across from him. No pretense of checking if she had a moment, no gesture toward the counter. Just sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him with the specific directness she'd only recently started using with him, the real version, the one that wasn't managed. "You said you had something to say," she said. "The true version." "I did. I've been thinking about that all week." "Me too." A beat. "Are you going to make me wait through the whole coffee?" she asked, and there was something underneath it that was almost amusement but carried more tension than that. "No," he said. He put both hands flat on the table, which was a gesture he didn't normally make, and which felt slightly absurd even as he did it, but he kept them there. "I'd like to take you to dinner, not here. Somewhere else. Sometime when you're not working. You and me, without the counter between us." He paused. "That's the true version." Emma looked at him. The silence stretched for about 4 seconds, which is a very educational amount of time to sit in silence after saying something true to someone. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay, yes?" "Okay, yes." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that suggested she'd been slightly enjoying his barely concealed tension. "Did you think I was going to say no?" "I thought it was possible." "Because of—" She tilted her head slightly. "Because of what I am and what you are?" He looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" "You're—" She made a small gesture that encompassed, apparently, all of his professional and financial context. And I'm a barista who can't afford the neighborhoods your company probably owns buildings in. She said it directly, without apology or self-pity. Just a fact she was putting on the table to see what he'd do with it. I'm a person who's been sitting in the same booth every Tuesday for a year, hoping you'd tell me why you drew a heart on my receipt, he said. That's a more accurate description of what I am, in this context. Emma was quiet for a moment. Something worked through her face. The neighborhood thing doesn't factor in for you? She asked. Does it factor in for you? I asked first. No, he said. It doesn't. Should it? She looked at the table. People in your position usually... Emma. He waited until she looked at him. I don't want to have the conversation about my position. I've had versions of that conversation my whole adult life, and it's never been about me. You're the first person in a long time who's talked to me like I'm just a person. I'd like to keep having that. She held his gaze. He could see her weighing it, not the offer itself, but the implications of it, the logistics of two lives that didn't obviously fit together, the reasonable fear of starting something that has obvious structural complications. He watched her think and didn't try to preempt the thinking. Friday, she said. Friday? I'm off Friday. If you want dinner Friday. She looked slightly like someone who has made a decision quickly enough that the second guessing hasn't caught up yet. Nothing too, I don't want somewhere that requires a dress code, just somewhere real. I know a place, he said. No dress code. Excellent pasta. You cook? Reasonably well. She looked at him for a moment. You're suggesting your apartment. I'm suggesting wherever you're comfortable. If that's a restaurant, I'll find one. If you'd rather, your apartment is fine, she said, quickly, like she was getting it out before she thought better of it. It's actually, I'd rather that. Somewhere without an audience. Something warm moved through him. Okay, Friday. Okay. She looked at her hands, then back at him. This is strange, right? We've been talking for almost a year, and this is the part that feels strange. The year of receipts and booth conversations was the easy part, he said. She laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one that reached her eyes first. And he thought, there it is. That's the one. Fair point, she said. She stood up to go back to the counter and then paused, looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Open, slightly undefended, not quite managed. For what it's worth, she said, I've been wanting you to ask for a while. I just didn't know how to... She stopped. I draw hearts on paper. I'm not great at the direct version. You seem pretty direct to me. With most things. A beat. Not this. She went back to the counter. He sat with his coffee and the particular quality of the next few minutes. The strange, light-headed clarity that comes when something you've been carrying as a question becomes an answer. Tommy appeared at his elbow, approximately 30 seconds later, ostensibly to wipe down the nearby table, but transparently there for another reason. Did she say yes? He asked, not quite quietly enough. Nathan looked at him. Were you listening? The whole café was listening, Tommy said, with the complete absence of remorse of a 19-year-old. Petrus is losing his mind in the kitchen. From the back, Petrus's voice. I'm not losing my mind, I'm simply emotional. He's emotional, Tommy confirmed. Nathan looked at the counter where Emma had her back to the room, and her shoulders were doing the thing they did when she was trying not to laugh. He looked back at Tommy. Yes, he said. She said yes. Tommy pumped his fist in a way that was deeply undignified, and then walked away whistling something that was probably meant to be casual. Friday came with a specific quality of winter light. Cold, clear, the sky the particular pale blue of February afternoons when the sun is present, but making no promises about warmth. Nathan had spent Thursday evening in a state of controlled domestic anxiety, cleaning the apartment to a standard that Lily noticed and commented on. Why is everything so clean? She'd asked, looking around with the air of someone who's found a change in their environment and hasn't yet decided if it's concerning. I cleaned. You always clean. This is different. This is like... She scrunched her nose. Like company clean. Emma's coming for dinner tomorrow. The way Lily's face moved through its response was one of the more memorable things Nathan had witnessed in recent memory. It went from neutral to processing to something incandescent, all within about 2 seconds. Here? she said. Here? You'll be at Grandma's. Lily had very clearly mixed feelings about this. She wanted to meet Emma. She'd made this want known with the persistence of someone lodging an official complaint. But she also understood, with a sophistication that occasionally unnerved him, that this particular evening was not for her. She wrestled with this quietly for a moment. "Tell her about me," she said finally. "I already have." "Tell her the good things." "All the things I've told her about you are good things." "Tell her I'm funny." She considered. "And smart. And that I named my elephant Kevin." "I'll tell her about Kevin. And Gerald. Gerald is important." He told her she'd meet Emma when the time was right and she would just have to trust him on the timing. Lily accepted this with the grace of someone filing the disagreement for future reference but choosing not to pursue it today. His mother had come to take Lily for the evening and had kissed Nathan on the cheek and then looked at him for a moment with the particular look that contained everything she wanted to say and was choosing not to, and said simply, "Have a good dinner." He'd appreciated that more than she knew. Emma arrived at 7:15, which was 15 minutes later than they'd said, and which she'd texted to warn him about at 7:05. "Running late. I'm sorry that the train was..." And then a long ellipsis that ended in just late. "I'm sorry." He'd replied, "It's fine. Take your time." And he'd meant it, which was itself a kind of data point about who he was when he was with her versus who he was in other contexts. The knock at the door produced a moment of complete stillness in which he was aware of his own heartbeat, in a way he found mildly absurd. He opened the door. Emma Brooks was standing in the hallway in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark green, slightly too big for her in a way that looked intentional, with her hair down for the first time he'd seen it, which he wasn't prepared for and had to make a small, rapid internal adjustment to accommodate. She was holding a bottle of wine like it was something she'd grabbed quickly, which he suspected it was, and she had the look of someone who had been slightly nervous on the way here and was making peace with that. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He stepped back. "Come in." She came in and looked around the apartment the way people do when they're in someone's home for the first time. Not invasively, just taking in the geography. He watched her face as she looked, the high ceilings, the city visible through the large windows, Lily's drawings on the refrigerator door, the scratch on his watch face on the side table near the couch. She moved toward the window and looked out at the city. "It's different from up here," she said. "You get used to it." "Do you?" He came to stand beside her, not close, just in the vicinity. The city spread below, February blue turning to the particular amber of early evening, a million lit windows in the middle distance. "Honestly, not entirely," he said. "It still doesn't feel like mine. The penthouse is the company's. I bought a normal apartment when Lily was born. Smaller, different neighborhood. But the board thought I should live somewhere that..." He stopped. "It doesn't matter. I haven't figured out how to make it feel like home." Emma looked at him. "What does home feel like?" He thought about Lily's strawberry shampoo, about the drawer with the receipts, about a cafe with burned espresso and cracked vinyl and holiday lights that stayed up too long. "Familiar," he said, "like something that knows you've been there before and is glad you're back." Emma was quiet for a moment. "That's a good definition," she said. They stood at the window for a moment, close enough that he was aware of the precise distance between them, and then she turned toward the kitchen and said, "You said something about pasta?" He cooked. This was not a performance, like he actually cooked, in the specific way of someone who has made this recipe enough times that he doesn't have to think about it, which meant he could think about other things, which meant he was more present than he would have been if he'd been concentrating. Emma sat on a stool at the kitchen island and opened the wine and poured 2 glasses and watched him work in the way she did everything, attentively, without making the attention feel like pressure. They talked the way they'd been talking for months, except the format had changed and the change mattered. No counter between them, no other customers, no clock on her shift. Just 2 people in a kitchen while pasta water heated and the city moved outside the window, and the conversation went where it went without anyone managing it. She told him about her first apartment in the city, a studio in a neighborhood that had since become somewhere she could no longer afford. shared with two other women she'd found on the internet, and one of whom had become an actual friend, and one of whom had stolen $40 from her wallet and moved out without notice. He told her about the first office, the two-room space, Marcus and him eating takeout on the floor because they didn't have enough chairs yet. She laughed at the part about the chairs. He laughed at the part about the wallet. They talked about Daniel. She told him things she hadn't told him in the cafe, fuller things, the texture of what it had been like to grow up with a brother 4 years older who was fundamentally different from her in most ways, and fundamentally similar in the ones that mattered, who had called her every Sunday from college, who had been better than her at soccer but had always pretended otherwise to preserve her ego, who had developed the heart-drawing habit from a fourth-grade teacher named Mrs. Okafor and kept it so consistently into adulthood that their mother used to buy him red pens in bulk. "I have a box of them," Emma said. "His pens. Red Bics. My mom gave them to me when I left for the city." She turned her wine glass. "I've been drawing with them this whole time." Nathan was still. "The hearts on the receipts, his pens." "Yeah." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know if that changes anything about how it feels. But it's true." He thought about the 17 receipts in the drawer, about what it meant that they'd been drawn with Daniel's pens, by Daniel's sister, in the same spirit Daniel would have drawn them. The intention of it, the specific kindness of it, passed forward from a fourth-grade teacher to a boy, to his grieving sister, to a lonely man in a corner booth. "It doesn't change anything," he said. "It adds to it." She nodded, just once, but the nod carried weight. He served the pasta. They ate at the kitchen island rather than the dining table, which seated 12 and was the kind of furniture you bought when you were told to buy furniture appropriate to a certain kind of life, and which Nathan had eaten at alone exactly 3 times. The island was better. The island was actually the right size for this. Emma ate in the way that suggested she'd been genuinely hungry. Not self-consciously, just present with the food. She told him it was excellent. He said it was the same recipe every time. She said that was the point of a good recipe. He agreed. They talked about Lily, and this felt important. Not because he'd avoided it before, but because the context had shifted. Before, Lily had been a piece of information, something Nathan held somewhat carefully. Now Emma already knew about Gerald and Kevin. She already knew about the city map that was better than the regular map. She asked what Lily was like in the mornings, and he laughed before he could stop it. The specific laugh of a parent asked about their child's most challenging quality, and said like a very confident construction worker arriving at a job site who is surprised to find the site needs work. Emma laughed. "Does she know you compare her to a construction worker?" She'd probably take it as a compliment. "She sounds like someone who would." They finished eating. He made coffee. They moved from the island to the couch without planning to, the natural migration of people who have been talking for 3 hours and don't want to stop. The city was fully dark now, all lit windows and the steady, distant murmur of a place that never entirely went quiet. Emma held her coffee cup in both hands and tucked her feet up under her in the corner of the couch. And the ease of it, the unself-consciousness, the fact that she was comfortable enough to do that, settled something in Nathan's chest that had been quietly tense all evening without his full acknowledgement. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." She looked at her cup. "What do you actually want from this?" She made a small gesture that encompassed the evening, the apartment, the direction they were going. Not the diplomatic version, the true one. He looked at her. "I want Tuesdays to not be enough anymore," he said. She looked up. "I want to know what you're like on Thursdays and Saturdays. I want to know what you think about things when you have time to think about them, not in between customers. I want Lily to meet you, not soon, when it's right, but I want her to meet you because I think she's going to like you as much as she's already decided she does from a distance, which is a lot." He paused. "I want to stop being careful with things that deserve to be said directly." Emma was very still. "That's the true version," he said. A silence. "Okay," she said, which was becoming her word for things she meant completely. "Okay?" She looked at him with that expression, the undefended one, the real one. "I've been coming to work on Tuesdays for almost a year, specifically hoping you'd be there. I stopped being able to remember what Tuesdays felt like before you." She looked at her coffee. That's my true version. He put his cup on the side table. She watched him do it. Emma, he said. Yeah. Can I? He stopped. He'd been about to ask permission for something, which she would probably have thought was either very considerate or very overthought. He let the sentence stop. She leaned forward and closed the distance herself, the way she did most things, decided, once the decision was made, without unnecessary ceremony. It was not a long kiss. It was not dramatic. It was warm and careful and specific. And when they pulled back, she looked at him with the expression of someone who has finally said something they'd been holding for a long time and found, to their own surprise, that the words hadn't broken anything. Still okay, she said. He almost smiled. He did, actually. A real one. Good. She picked her coffee back up and they sat in the city's nighttime quiet, close enough now that the distance had become irrelevant, talking about nothing consequential for another hour in the way that only happens when the consequential things have already been said. When she left at 11, he walked her to the door and she stood in the hallway in the too large green coat and looked at him with one hand on the wall, the ease of the evening still in her face. Same time next Tuesday, she said. Same time. And maybe Friday again. And maybe Friday again. She nodded once. Turned to go. Stopped. Turned back. She looked at him with something he hadn't quite seen on her before. A kind of nakedness, not in the vulnerable sense, but in the sense of something set down. I'm glad you didn't throw away the first one, she said. He knew exactly what she meant. Me too. She went down the hallway. He closed the door and stood with his back against it in the quiet apartment. And the quiet didn't sound like what it used to. It sounded like the before side of something, the pause before a note resolves, and he stood in it for a moment with the specific feeling of a man who has finally stopped being afraid of the direction he's moving in. He went to the nightstand, opened the drawer. 17 small folded receipts in order. He looked at them for a long time. Then he went to his desk and found a piece of paper. And he sat down and, something he hadn't done in a very long time, he began to write something that was not a contract or a memo or a response to a problem. Just words to himself about what the evening had been, about what the year had been, about 17 receipts and a red pen and a man who had almost thrown away the first one. He wrote until past midnight, and when he was done, the quiet apartment felt less like an absence and more like a room that someone was about to come back to. That was enough. For tonight, that was more than enough. The weeks after that Friday had a different texture than the weeks before it. Nathan noticed this the way you notice a change in your own handwriting, not until you're looking at it directly and then obvious. The days didn't move differently. The work didn't lighten. Lily still woke up at 6:15 with the determination of someone who has places to be and opinions about cereal. But the shape of the week had changed. It had a structure now that it hadn't had before. Not just Tuesdays, but the knowledge that Tuesday was coming, that Friday was possible, that the space between was not just waiting, but the ordinary texture of a life that had somewhere to go. He didn't know how to explain this to anyone in a way that didn't sound smaller than it was. So mostly he didn't explain it. He just lived it, quietly, the way you live the things that matter most, without announcing them, without being entirely sure they're real yet, handling them carefully the way you'd carry something full. Emma, for her part, moved into this new configuration the way she moved into most things, without drama, with attention, not entirely certain, but willing. The Friday dinners became a pattern. Not every week. Her schedule was inconsistent, and Nathan traveled twice in February, and once she had a family thing she mentioned briefly and didn't elaborate on, but often enough that his kitchen started to feel like a place two people used rather than one person passed through. She left a book on his side table one Friday evening, and neither of them mentioned it, and it stayed there, and it was the first thing that had appeared in that apartment that wasn't his or Lily's in 3 years. He looked at it sometimes. Just the book, sitting there. A paperback with a cracked spine and someone's pencil notes in the margins, hers or a previous reader's he didn't know. He didn't read it. He just appreciated its presence in the specific way you appreciate evidence that your life has expanded to include something you didn't have before. The hardest part, in those early weeks, was not the relationship itself. The relationship was, in its own imperfect, occasionally awkward, frequently wonderful way, easier than Nathan had expected. The hard part was the thing he hadn't fully anticipated, the grief that came alongside the happiness. Not instead of it, alongside it. He called Dr. Sato on a Wednesday in late February, something he did once a month and had been doing since Claire died. She was a small woman in her 60s who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had an office with a plant that had been the same size for 3 years. And Nathan had told her things in that office that he hadn't told anyone else. He told her about Emma now, about the receipts and the Tuesdays and the Friday dinners, about the book on the side table. Dr. Sato listened. She had a way of listening that felt active, like she was doing something with what you said rather than just storing it. "How does it feel?" she asked when he'd finished. "Good," he said. "Mostly good." And he stopped. She waited. "I keep thinking about Claire," he said. Not in a, he was careful with the words, not in a way that feels like I'm choosing wrong. More like I'm aware of her absence more specifically. Before the absence was general. Now it has a shape. Dr. Sato nodded slowly. "That's not uncommon," she said. "When we build new attachments, we often experience a secondary grief alongside the happiness. It's not contradiction. It's completeness." "She would have liked Emma," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. He said it the way you say things in that office, because they're true and there's room for them. "What makes you think so?" "Because Emma's direct. Claire valued direct. She had no patience for people who talked around things." He looked at the plant on the windowsill. Emma also would have driven her crazy sometimes because they would have had the same stubbornness pointed in different directions. They would have argued about something stupid and then been fine. Dr. Sato almost smiled. "That's a specific picture." "I've been thinking about it." "That's healthy," she said. "The ability to imagine them in the same world rather than only in separate compartments. That's integration. That's not disloyalty, Nathan. It's wholeness." He sat with that for the rest of the session and for most of the drive home. Wholeness. He turned the word over. He'd been operating for 3 years with the assumption that wholeness was something that had happened once and been interrupted, something he'd been before April of that year and had not been since. He hadn't considered that wholeness might be something you rebuild, imperfectly, with different material, into a different shape than before. That the new shape might not look like the old one and still be whole. He thought about this while making pasta that Thursday evening. With Lily sitting at the island doing homework, she was clearly approaching with minimum viable effort, and the thought felt like something settling, something that had been slightly off-center for a long time finding a better position. "Dad," Lily said. "Is Emma your girlfriend?" He stirred the sauce. "Where did you hear that word?" "I'm 5, not an infant." She put down her pencil. "Is she?" He thought about how to answer this and decided on the direct version, which he'd been practicing. "I don't know exactly what word we'd use," he said, "but she's someone I care about more than a friend." Lily received this information with the seriousness it deserved. "When do I get to meet her?" "Soon." "You keep saying soon." "Because it keeps being true." "I'm working on when." "Work faster," Lily said, and picked up her pencil. The when arrived, as these things often do, not through planning, but through accident. It was a Saturday in March, and Nathan had not expected to be at Hollow Creek on a Saturday. But Lily had a birthday party for a classmate in the afternoon, a chaotic affair involving a bouncy castle and what Nathan understood to be an ambitious face-painting situation. And the venue was 3 blocks from the café, and he dropped Lily off and found himself with 90 minutes and the particular aimless energy of a parent who has nowhere to be for a fixed and specific time. He went to the café. He hadn't thought about whether Emma would be working Saturdays. It was the kind of thing he should probably have known by now, but had been operating without because Tuesdays were Tuesdays, and the other days of her schedule were information he'd been careful not to be too curious about, in the way you're careful with a thing you don't want to seem like you're tracking. She was there. She was behind the counter with her back to the door when he came in, and she turned at the bell and stopped when she saw him in the specific way of someone who did not expect to see a particular face. "Saturday," she said. "Lily has a birthday party." He gestured in the general direction. Bouncy castle situation. And you came here. Apparently. He looked around the café, which was more populated on a Saturday than it was on Tuesday evenings. Families, a group of college students, an older couple sharing a single pastry in the manner of people who have been together long enough to have established division protocols. Is this... Should I not? Sit down, Emma said. Don't be weird about it. He sat in his booth. The booth, which on some level he'd started to think of as his, which was ridiculous for a booth in a public cafe, and also not entirely ridiculous given the number of Tuesdays it had held him. He sat in it on a Saturday, and it felt slightly different, a familiar place at an unfamiliar angle, like hearing a song played in a new key. Emma brought his coffee herself, which she didn't have to do. A teenage girl he didn't recognize was working register today, and she stood at the table in the way that said she had a minute. How long do you have? She asked. 90 minutes. 85 now. She slid into the booth, a Saturday version of the Tuesday habit, which felt like something evolving into something else, categories softening. She looked at him with the ease that had developed between them since the Friday dinners. A new ease, less careful, more specific. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. When do I get to meet Lily? He looked at her. Not... She held up a hand slightly. Not because I'm pressuring anything. I'm not. I know it's complicated, and she's 5, and that's a whole different... She stopped. Tried again. She's the most important part of your life. And I want to know you. Actually know you, not just the Tuesday and Friday version. She met his eyes. And I think you want that too. But we keep not talking about it. He was quiet for a moment. She was right, and they both knew it. He'd been holding the two halves of his life with a care that had started necessary and continued from habit, and habit had started to look a little like avoidance if you examined it honestly. Next Saturday, he said. Emma looked slightly surprised, as if she'd been prepared for more negotiation. Yeah? There's a farmer's market near the park. She likes it. The woman with the honey samples has been her friend for 6 months. He held Emma's gaze. If you're free. I'm free next Saturday. Then next Saturday. A beat. Was that so hard? Emma asked. Somewhat, yes. She smiled at that, the real one, the one that led with the eyes. I'm nervous too, for what it's worth. You don't seem nervous. I'm very good at seeming not nervous. It's one of my primary skills. She put her hands flat on the table. What if she doesn't like me? She already likes you. She doesn't know me. She knows about you. There's a distinction, but it's not as large as you're thinking. He looked at her steadily. She named your receipts. Emma blinked. She calls them Emma's hearts. She's been asking about them since she was 4. He paused. She found the first few when she was going through my jacket pocket looking for a gummy bear I'd promised her. Emma stared at him. You told me that story. You said she found some receipts. I didn't tell you what she called them afterward. A silence. Something moved through Emma's face that she didn't manage to contain. Something that went from surprise to something warmer. Something that had to do with being a person who has been known without realizing it. Her eyes did the thing they'd done the night he told her he'd kept every receipt. Not quite tears, but the territory adjacent. Emma's hearts, she said. She'll probably tell you this herself next Saturday. I'm telling you now so you're not caught off guard. She nodded very slowly. She looked at the table. She was quiet for a moment, and he let the quiet be what it needed to be. Daniel would have thought this was the funniest and best thing, she said eventually. Which part? All of it. She looked up. The receipts ending up in a billionaire's nightstand drawer. A 5-year-old naming them. The fact that it all started because Mrs. Okafor drew a heart on a 4th grader's homework in Columbus, Ohio, and 40 years later, it ended up here. She shook her head. He would have said, he always said that kindness traveled further than you thought, that you never know where something you do ends up. Nathan thought about the specific chain of it. Mrs. Okafor to Daniel, to Emma, to the man in the corner booth. A small red heart, drawn in 4th grade, multiplied across years and grief and distance into 17, now more, folded receipts in a nightstand drawer. He was right, Nathan said. He usually was. She said it with the particular smile that belonged to Daniel. A little sad, mostly warm, the smile of someone who has integrated an absence. He would have liked you, she added. I told you that before. I'll keep telling you because it's true. I think I would have liked him too. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. The farmer's market Saturday arrived with the kind of early spring day that felt like an argument for continuing to live in the city. Cool enough to need a jacket, clear enough that the sky looked freshly painted, the park trees with the specific pale green of new leaves that only lasts about 2 weeks before deepening into full summer. Lily wore her purple jacket, the one with the rabbit embroidery that she'd chosen herself and that Nathan had learned not to comment on. She had Gerald tucked under her arm, which she did on important occasions, apparently for moral support, and she had the particular expression of a child who has received information about an event and formed detailed expectations about it. Nathan had said, Emma's going to meet us at the market. Lily had said, okay. Then approximately 4 seconds later, what should I wear? He'd said whatever she liked. She'd selected the rabbit jacket. He took this as a sign that she understood the significance of the occasion. Emma was already at the market entrance when they arrived, and this detail mattered to Nathan afterward when he thought back on it. She'd arrived first, which was the kind of thing that looks small and isn't. She'd arrived first and was standing with her hands in her coat pockets looking at a flower stand across the path, and when she heard them coming, she turned. And her face when she saw Lily was an expression Nathan had not seen on her before, open and slightly overwhelmed in a way she hadn't prepared for. The way you sometimes aren't prepared for a child's specific reality to be more fully present than you'd imagined. Lily looked at Emma with the comprehensive assessment she gave new information. You're Emma, she said. I am, Emma said. You're Lily. Yes. A beat. That's Gerald. She held up the rabbit. He comes to important things. Emma looked at Gerald with the seriousness the introduction deserved. It's good to meet you, Gerald. He doesn't talk, Lily clarified. But he listens. Good quality in a companion, Emma said. Lily considered this and then, in the specific way of children who have decided something without warning, without transition, without anyone planning it, she reached out and took Emma's hand. Just took it. The way she took Nathan's hand when they walked somewhere, automatic, like it was simply the right thing for the configuration. Emma looked down at the small hand in hers and then up at Nathan, with an expression he could not have described accurately if asked, and did not try to. He looked back at her and shrugged slightly, which was the only honest response he had. They walked into the market. The next 2 hours were not cinematic. They were not perfectly orchestrated. Lily talked constantly, which was her default setting, and covered topics ranging from Gerald's position on honey samples to a detailed theory she'd developed about why clouds were slower than birds. And Emma listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention that Lily, who was, at 5, already excellent at detecting the difference between genuine and performed interest, clearly registered, because her behavior with Emma had the ease of someone who has been heard. They stopped at the honey stand. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Papadakis, was in her 70s and had been Lily's friend for months, in the sincere way that some older adults become friends with specific children. Mrs. Papadakis offered samples with a small wooden stick and asked Emma if she was Lily's new friend, and Emma said yes, and Lily said Emma was her dad's friend, a distinction she made with a diplomatic care that told Nathan she'd given some thought to how to describe this. They ate pastries from a bakery stand that Lily chose by a process of evaluation that took 4 minutes and involved 2 return visits before a final decision. Emma and Nathan stood beside each other while Lily conducted her assessment, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and Emma said quietly, without looking at him, "She's exactly how I imagined her." "Is she what you expected?" "No, she's more." She watched Lily finally point decisively at a cinnamon roll the size of her head. "She's a whole person." "She's been a whole person since she was about 18 months old. It was mildly terrifying." Emma laughed softly. "You did good." He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure he'd done it. Lily felt more like something that had happened to him, fully formed, than something he'd built. But he accepted the words because Emma meant them, and because on certain mornings when Lily was at the kitchen island explaining her theories about clouds to her cereal, he thought he might have done something right after all. Walking back through the market later, Lily between them with the enormous cinnamon roll making significant progress, she said, not to either of them in particular, just to the air. "Emma, do you know about Dad's drawer?" Emma glanced at Nathan. He looked at the sky. "What drawer?" she said. "The nightstand one, with all the papers." A pause. "Tell me about the papers," Emma said, with a tone so perfectly neutral it was almost an art form. "He has all your hearts. He keeps them in there." Lily licked cinnamon off her thumb with total satisfaction. "From every Tuesday. He says he didn't mean to keep them, but he kept them anyway." Emma looked at Nathan. He continued looking at the sky, which was not helping him. "I know about the papers," Emma said. Lily looked up at her. "Did he tell you?" "He did." "Good." She took another bite of the cinnamon roll, considering. "I told him he should ask you about them, but he took a really long time." "He did," Emma agreed, "but he got there. I helped." "I believe that." Lily nodded, satisfied. She reached up and took both their hands simultaneously, the way children do when they're walking between two adults, the complete naturalness of it, the full confidence that hands are available for the taking. And she walked between them through the farmer's market on a March Saturday with Gerald tucked under her arm, eating her cinnamon roll, occasionally sharing a piece of her cloud theory with whoever seemed to be listening. Nathan looked across the top of Lily's head at Emma. Emma looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything to say that the moment hadn't already said, more completely than words would have. Thus, spring arrived the way it always did. Not gradually, not all at once, but in arguments. Warm day followed by cold, followed by 2 warm days, and then a week of rain that made everyone in the city irritable, and then suddenly a Tuesday in April where the trees were fully green and the air had changed, and you walked outside and thought, there it is. The season had been deciding for weeks and had finally made up its mind. Nathan arrived at Hollow Creek that April Tuesday at 5:40 p.m. and sat in his booth, and the door was open for the first time this year, a prop keeping it ajar, the street sounds and the spring air coming through. The cafe looked the same as always, thus. Same cracked vinyl, same overhead lights that were still too harsh, same Petros behind the counter, doing something with a pastry he was clearly very invested in. Tommy had been promoted again in a way that had shuffled his hours, so he was now working days, which meant his replacement, a woman named Sarah, who was extremely competent and had approximately 2% of Tommy's conversational energy, was on register. Emma came from the back carrying a box of something and saw Nathan and set the box down and came to his booth with his coffee before he'd done anything except take his coat off, the choreography so deeply established that neither of them had to think about it anymore. She sat across from him. They looked at each other across the table, and there was something in the looking that had accumulated. Months of Tuesdays, the Friday dinners, the farmer's market with Lily, the nights after that, and the mornings that had occasionally followed. The slow, imperfect, unglamorous process of two people learning each other in their less managed versions. There was history in the looking now, not ancient history, new history, their history, still forming. "Good week?" she asked. "Long. The acquisition is finally resolving the way it should have resolved 3 months ago." "Told you it would?" "You told me to be patient, which is not the same as told me it would resolve." "The patience was implied." He drank his coffee. Outside, the street moved at its spring pace, a little faster than winter, not quite at summer speed yet. "How was Ohio?" he asked. She'd been home the previous weekend. A longer visit this time, 4 days, the first time she'd stayed that long since Daniel died. She'd told him she was going. She'd told him, when she came back, that it had been hard and necessary, and that she'd sat in Daniel's room and talked to him the way she sometimes did, which she'd never told anyone before, and had told Nathan because that's what you do when someone has stopped being a category and started being the person you tell things to. "Better than last time," she said. "Mom and I went through some of his things she'd been keeping." She wrapped her hands around her own coffee. "She gave me his jersey from high school, soccer, number 14. Is it yours now? It's in the hall closet of my apartment. I'm not ready to decide what to do with it yet, but I needed to have it. She looked at him. Progress comes in strange shapes. It does. I talked to my mom about us, about you. She said it with the slight self-consciousness of someone reporting something that was larger in the doing than it appears in the telling. She wants to see a picture. I said you're on Forbes. She can Google it. She said that doesn't count. Smart woman. Infuriatingly so. Emma looked at the table. She said he sounds kind. I told her the receipt story, the whole version. Mrs. Okafor and Daniel, and then me, and then you keeping them. She looked up. She cried. Nathan was quiet. She said Daniel would have loved it, Emma said, that he would have said it was proof. A pause. I asked proof of what? She said, of the thing he always believed, that what you put out comes back eventually. Sometimes in people. Sometimes in the last place you'd think to look. The afternoon café hummed around them. Petros achieved whatever he'd been trying to achieve with the pastry and said something to himself in Greek that sounded satisfied. The spring air came through the propped door. Nathan said, after a moment, I want to meet her. Emma looked at him. My mom. When it feels right, if you want that. He held her gaze. I'm not setting a timeline, but I want you to know that it's something I want. Because she raised you and she loved Daniel and she sounds like someone I'd like to know. Emma looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said. Soft. The real version of okay, not the quick one. Okay. She sat with her coffee for a moment and then, with the particular decisiveness that was one of her truest qualities, the thing underneath the steadiness, the thing that actually moved her when she was done being careful, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. No preamble. No announcement. Just her hand on his, on the table in the cafe in the spring afternoon. Nathan, she said. Yeah. I love you. The words landed simply, without decoration, the way the true things usually do. Not at a dramatic moment, not with a sunset or a carefully chosen restaurant. In a corner booth on a Tuesday afternoon in a cafe that smelled like burned espresso, with someone else's playlist coming through the speakers, and Petros talking to himself in the background. He turned his hand over under hers. I love you too, he said. She nodded, once, like something confirmed. Not surprised. Confirmed. Like she'd been carrying the knowledge and was glad to have it acknowledged. Good, she said. You sound like Lily. I'm going to take that as a compliment. It is one, There's a particular thing that happens, Nathan had come to understand, when you stop waiting for your life to return to something it used to be and start looking at what it actually is. It doesn't happen at once. It doesn't happen at a specific moment you can point to later and say, there, that was when. It happens the way seasons change, through accumulation, through ordinary days, through the specific weight of time spent with the right people in the right rooms. He understood this more fully on a Tuesday evening in May, about 3 months after the first Friday dinner, sitting in his booth at Hollow Creek with the door open to the warm evening, and Emma bringing his coffee and Lily, who was with him on this particular Tuesday, because her school had a professional development day and his parents weren't available, and Emma had said casually, perfectly casually, she can just come to the cafe, sitting across from him eating a brown butter pastry with the focused dedication she brought to pastries she considered worth the attention. Lily had been in the cafe for 40 minutes and had already formed opinions about the espresso machine, had a conversation with Petros about rabbits that had gone longer than Nathan would have predicted, and had given Sarah a thorough assessment of the pastry case that Sarah had received with impressive grace. She was eating the pastry now. She looked to Nathan, entirely at home. Emma came to the table and looked at the two of them. The man in the corner booth, the small girl with the rabbit-embroidered jacket, leaving cinnamon sugar on the receipt he hadn't touched yet, and she had an expression on her face that she didn't bother to manage. How's the pastry? She asked Lily. Very good. Second best thing here. Emma raised an eyebrow. What's the first? Lily pointed at Nathan. Dad. But you're third. I'm flattered to place. You're close to second, Lily said generously. I'm still deciding. Emma looked at Nathan. He looked back at her. Something was alive in her face, something that was warm and real and faintly amazed, the expression of someone who has found themselves somewhere better than they planned. He thought about Mrs. Okafor, about a fourth-grade classroom in Ohio and a teacher who drew a heart on a child's paper and set something in motion that traveled 20-something years through a boy's whole life and his death and his sister's grief and a city she moved to and a cafe she worked in and a man who almost threw away a receipt. He thought about how nothing important announces itself, how the things that change your life show up in ordinary packaging, a cracked vinyl booth, a name tag with a dented E, a small red drawing you could easily not notice if you weren't paying attention. He had almost not been paying attention. He was so grateful he'd been paying attention. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep on the cafe couch that Petros had produced from somewhere with the fanfare of a man who has been waiting for an occasion to deploy it, Emma sat beside Nathan in the booth with the empty cafe around them and the warm May evening through the open door, and she pulled a receipt from her apron. She set it on the table. He looked at it, the familiar fold of it, the texture of the paper. He looked at her. "Open it," she said. He unfolded it. The heart. The same red ink, the same slightly uneven line on the right side that had been there from the beginning. And beneath it, in Emma's handwriting, not small and careful this time, but larger, unhesitant. "The best customer became my forever family." He read it. He read it again. He looked at Emma, who was watching him with the expression of someone who has said the true thing and is waiting to see where it lands. He thought about forever family, about the specific weight of those words, not as a future promise, but as a present truth. Lily asleep on the cafe couch, Petros somewhere in the back singing something in Greek, a drawer full of receipts, a book on a side table with pencil notes in the margins. "Emma," he said. "Don't overthink it," she said. "It's just what it is." He leaned across the table and kissed her, in the empty cafe with the spring evening coming through the door. And when he pulled back, she had the expression she always had when something real had happened. Not surprised, just present with it, fully there. "I'm not overthinking it," he said. "I'm thinking about it exactly the right amount." She laughed. He held on to the sound of it. He folded the receipt carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Not the drawer. This one wasn't for the drawer. This one was going somewhere he could see it. Lily stirred on the couch. She opened one eye, looked at both of them, said, "Okay, good," in the specific voice of a half-asleep 5-year-old, and closed it again. Nathan looked at Emma. Emma looked at Nathan. Outside, the city moved at its May pace, unhurried, alive, full of its own ordinary days and the people having them, each with their own accumulation of small things that had turned into something large. Somewhere in there, a fourth-grade teacher who had no idea, a boy who had grown into someone who drew hearts on everything. A woman who had carried his pens across a country and kept drawing because it was the one way she knew to say, "You are not invisible, you matter, someone is here." And a man who had almost thrown away the first receipt. Almost. But he hadn't. He hadn't thrown it away. And that small thing, that nothing of a decision, keeping a piece of paper you could have crumpled without thinking, had turned out to be the hinge point, the place where one direction of a life met another direction and chose. The place where the loneliness didn't end exactly, but became something you were no longer carrying alone. He thought, some things find you. Not the things you planned for, or the things you worked toward, or the things you could have designed if you'd been smarter, or more intentional, or more ready. The things that find you, that show up in the corner of a receipt in a cafe you turned into by accident, drawn by a woman who was keeping her brother alive the only way she had left. You just have to be paying attention. You have to not throw it away. The booth held the three of them, the sleeping child, the woman with the red pen, the man who had kept every receipt, in the ordinary, imperfect, entirely sufficient way that the right places hold you. Not because they're beautiful, not because they're what you'd have chosen, because they're yours, because you came back to them, and they kept being there. And somewhere in the repetition of that, the word home stopped being past tense. Nathan put his arm along the back of the booth, and Emma leaned into the space that made, and outside the evening did what evenings do, moved through its hours, carrying everyone in it toward the next ordinary day that would turn out to matter more than it looked. The cafe smelled like burned espresso. It always did. He had never been so glad of a smell in his life.